Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little different. You've probably wondered, at least once, how people coped with intimacy and desire in the darkest of times, like say during one of the most horrifying pandemics in history, the Black Death. Spoiler alert, it involves plague masks, wild rumours, unsanitary cures, and a lot of very bad advice. Also, heads up, you probably won't survive this if you're planning to make out with anyone. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments, what city are you watching from and what time is it for you right now? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's late, midnight, maybe later. You're somewhere in Europe. Doesn't really matter where, honestly. Every town smells like a mix of mouldy bread, vinegar, and raw fear. The year is 1348, and the Black Death has arrived. Outside your window, the bell at the church tolls again. Another soul gone. That makes 4 today. You've lost count of how many bodies have passed by your door in the last week, bundled in tattered cloth, carted off by pale-faced men who've started using perfume-drenched masks stuffed with herbs because even they can't take the stench anymore. You press your hand to your chest. No boils, not yet. You're lucky, still breathing, still hungry, and still, well, let's just say you haven't entirely forgotten the pleasures of the flesh. But around here, desire is getting a seriously bad reputation. Rumours swirl like smoke in the tavern and over steaming cauldrons of thin cabbage stew. They say the plague is God's punishment for sins of the flesh, not just lust, but actual, touchy, sweaty, groaning sin. The kind of sin that makes you close your eyes and forget just for a moment how close the end feels. People are scared to touch. Lovers avoid each other's gaze. Married couples sleep back to back, whispering prayers instead of pillow talk. You're warned not to share a bed, lest the sweat from another's body draw disease into your own. Priests bark sermons in town squares, flames of hell dancing in their eyes. The wages of sin is death, they cry, and no one dares laugh, because everywhere people are dying, and fast. Still, not everyone buys it. Your neighbour, he's an apothecary, the sort who wears dried toad skins on his belt and once swore by leech therapy for a stubbed toe. He tells you it's not sin, it's the humours. He means the body's fluids. According to medical thought of the day, you've got 4. Blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Like the weirdest box of crayons ever. If they're balanced, you're healthy. If they're off, you're toast. And sex stirs those humours like soup over a fire. Here's where it gets weird. Some doctors warn that intercourse overheats the body, draining the vital energies that fight off illness. They say the act, especially for men, releases too much warm, moist air, leaving the body cold and vulnerable. Other thinkers argue the opposite, that restraint leads to toxic buildup. If you never let your body express its urges, the poison festers. So yes, you might actually be more likely to catch the plague if you don't have sex. Congratulations, you're confused and also scared to death. And let's not ignore the spiritual side. The church has opinions, so many opinions. Religious leaders across Europe declare that the plague is divine judgment. Cities are filthier, morals are looser, and young people are dancing in barns after dark. This is what happens, they claim, when modesty dies and lust is allowed to roam free. To purge the sin, you must purge desire. You're told to fast, to pray, to turn away from all physical pleasure. Sex, even within marriage, becomes suspect. Some couples take vows of celibacy, hoping their sacrifice will spare them. Others flagellate themselves in public, flailing their backs with barbed whips, weeping as they chant hymns, trying to bleed out their guilt before the pestilence catches up. But here's a twist. Not all clergy agree, a few whisper a different theory. Quietly in the back of dimly lit monasteries, some say that to feel joy, even carnal joy, is to rebel against despair. That in the act of intimacy there is something sacred, a spark of life that illness cannot touch. Those voices are rare, though. Most are drowned by the pounding of drums and the wails of mourners. You walk past a brothel that's been boarded up. Someone scratched a red X into the door. Plague. No one will go near it now, and yet, a few houses down, candles flicker behind drawn curtains. A whispered laugh escapes a window. Life, love, and lust cling to the edges of a world unravelling. Back in your room, you light a single taper and stare at the flame. Your thoughts flicker with it. You remember a touch, the warmth of another body, the way breathing changes when two people find solace in each other. And you wonder, not for the first time, if it's really sin that brought the plague, or just bad luck. A historical tidbit here. The actual Black Death killed somewhere between 75 to 200 million people across Europe, Asia and Africa. In some towns, entire populations were wiped out in weeks. People didn't understand germs, but they were desperate for answers, so they reached for what they had. Religion, folk medicine, astrology, and yeah, a whole bunch of wild sexual theories. A little fringe fact for you. Some medical texts of the time warned that having sex during the plague would not only weaken you, but might literally open your pores to bad air, miasma, that would seep into your body and rot your organs from the inside out, which honestly is kind of metal. And here's a scholarly debate that still isn't settled. Did people really become more sexually repressed during the plague years? Or did they cut loose and party like there was no tomorrow? Because hey, there often wasn't. Some accounts describe orgies in the countryside, secret midnight gatherings, masked balls that ended in feverish embraces. Others say people turned cold, frightened, walled off from each other. Truth is, both were probably happening, just not on the same street. You lean against the cold window pane, a chill runs through your spine. Somewhere in the distance a couple laughs again. For a second it sounds like music, then the bell tolls once more. You wake the next morning to coughing. Not yours, yet, but someone close by. A neighbour, maybe. The sound is wet, guttural, like something being wrenched from deep inside. It echoes through the alley, bouncing off the damp stone walls like an omen. You pull the covers tighter, suddenly hyper-aware of your own breathing. Every inhale feels suspect. Still, you're lucky, shall we? You can move, you can think, and you've been trying to make sense of what the local physicians have been saying, even if their advice is, let's say, confusing at best, and wildly contradictory at worst. You squint at a crumpled pamphlet you picked up near the apothecary, handwritten and smeared with something brown. Blood? Ink? Best not to ask. It reads like medical poetry, full of phrases like, excessive moistness of the body's spirit leads to imbalance of the inner fire. And that brings us to one of the biggest medical theories of the time, heat. Specifically your body's internal heat, called calor innatus, or innate warmth, if you're trying to impress someone at a medieval cocktail party. Doctors back then didn't know anything about viruses or bacteria, but they believed that your physical state was all about balancing heat and fluids. Too hot and you risk burning out your life force. Too cold and your organs could shrink, as if your insides were delicate laundry. Guess what sex does? That's right, it raises your inner heat, especially for men who are believed to emit a portion of their vital warmth through ejaculation. Not only were you losing heat, but you were losing some kind of mystical spark too. Think of it as medieval mana depletion. If you had too much sex, you'd basically short-circuit your body's defense system and let the plague slip in like an uninvited house guest. One physician, a big name back then, wrote that the act of Venus exhausts the soul and cools the liver, which is hilariously specific and also very concerning if you're planning a date night. But then comes the twist, because other medical thinkers, let's call them the pro-lust squad, thought just the opposite. They believed that a well-timed, moderate amount of sex could actually keep you healthy. Their reasoning? Pleasure was good for your mental state. A little release now and then kept the melancholy at bay. And back then, melancholy wasn't just feeling bummed out. It was a literal fluid. If you had too much of it, your body turned inward. Cold and sluggish, perfect conditions for pestilence to fester. So yes, some doctors encouraged regular, but not excessive lovemaking. A controlled burn to keep the inner fire burning, but not so hot that your vital spirits boiled over and left you hollow. One guy even suggested that if you were going to have sex, you should do it in the early evening, after a light meal in a well-ventilated room while avoiding sudden movements. Imagine seducing someone with that line. But this is medieval Europe, and nuance is not the strong suit of the age. The result? Chaos. Contradictions. One town swears by celibacy, the next tells its citizens to go forth and multiply carefully. You get a kind of moral whiplash just walking from one side of the village to the other. And let's not forget the role of astrology. That's right, planet-based medicine was huge. Your body was believed to be governed by the same cosmic forces that stirred the stars. Mercury ruled the nerves, Venus the loins, Mars the blood. The alignment of these celestial bodies could influence your health and your urges. One particularly anxious period during the plague occurred when Mars and Jupiter were in conjunction in Aquarius, which apparently is a bad time for your liver and your sex life. Fringe fact: some people thought that the plague was being spread not just by bad air, but by bad thoughts, especially lustful ones. Yes, your erotic daydreams could supposedly send out invisible waves of spiritual rot. If your neighbour fantasized a little too hard about the baker's apprentice, you might wake up with a rash and a 103-degree fever. The scholars, of course, couldn't agree. Heated debates broke out in universities across Europe. Well, those that hadn't been closed down or turned into emergency plague hospitals. One side insisted abstinence was the only safe path. The other side believed fear itself was the killer. A joyful, satisfied person would stand a better chance of surviving, they claimed, than a miserable celibate husk. You head to the marketplace to find something edible that doesn't look grey. Everyone's wearing masks now, fabric if they can afford it, damp rags if they can't. A travelling physician in a long black robe and that iconic bird beak mask walks stiffly past. Kids whisper that the beak is filled with crushed emeralds, which can cure plague breath. You don't believe it, but you also don't want to get too close. Over near the fish vendor, a few men whisper dirty jokes. One's holding a wooden amulet shaped like, well, something definitely not PG. They believe it wards off illness by keeping the body's humours lively. You try not to laugh. Honestly, anytime someone's body gets described in terms of liveliness during a pandemic, it just sounds desperate. Later that evening, back in your room, you stare at the ceiling and wonder who's right. The celibates? The cautious lovers? The herbalist who says you should mix mint and sheep's urine into a salve and rub it on your chest before sex? Yes, that was a real suggestion. There's no right answer. Only theories and stories, some whispered with reverence, others written in the margins of plague treatises, half lost to time and mildew. The only certainty is that people, then and now, don't stop wanting, even when death is at the door. Maybe especially then. You make it through another day. The coughing next door has stopped, but not in a good way. The cart came just before dawn, and someone in a long grey robe tossed a bundle into the back without even glancing inside. No prayers, no ceremony, just another nameless soul wrapped in dirty linen and silence. The air outside is still and sticky, like even the breeze is afraid to move too fast. You're trying not to think too hard about it. Instead, you focus on one of the big debates bouncing around the marketplace and chapel steps lately, the idea that celibacy might save your life. You hear it everywhere now, in sermons, in passing gossip, even carved into the stone wall outside the tavern. Chastity preserves the soul and the lungs, which is weirdly specific, but okay. The church has latched onto this idea like a dog with a ham bone. According to a rising chorus of monks and bishops, the Black Death is not just a disease, it's divine judgment. God has finally had enough of humanity's filthy, sinful behaviour, and he's wiping the slate clean with a fury that smells like rot and looks like bruises blooming under the skin. So what's the solution? Purity. Not just spiritual, but physical. Lust is the original sin's younger, hornier cousin, and giving in to it means inviting God's wrath directly into your household. Entire orders of monks and nuns begin preaching chastity as the only moral vaccine. In fact, some religious sects go even further, calling for permanent abstinence, married couples included. You hear stories of towns where husbands and wives take vows to live as brother and sister, shunning even the suggestion of physical closeness. They sleep in separate beds. They bathe at different times. They confess to thinking impure thoughts about their own spouses. There's even a noble woman in Florence, someone says, who locked herself in her own tower, convinced that any sexual contact, no matter how loving, would be her death sentence. Of course, some of this comes with an added bonus: control. Celibacy isn't just about dodging disease. It's a way for the church to tighten its grip. If you can be convinced that your most natural, most human urges are dangerous, you're easier to manage. Less inclined to rebel, more inclined to give money to absolve yourself. Still, it is not just clergy pushing the celibacy angle. Some physicians back them up. In medical texts copied and recopied by candlelight, you find the same warning repeated. Sex overtaxes the organs, weakens the breath, and, most damning of all, invites disease to penetrate your body through the pores left open by heated excitement. Translation: getting hot and bothered might literally kill you. It all starts to make you paranoid. Every passing glance feels loaded. Every accidental touch seems suspicious. Did she lean too close? Did you inhale too sharply? Is that a boil or just a freckle? And here's something extra unsettling. In some regions, celibacy was enforced, at least temporarily. Town councils would issue moral edicts, forbidding any public display of affection. No kissing, no touching, no suggestive dancing, and absolutely no gathering in dark corners. Violators could be fined, or worse, forced to stand in the square with signs declaring their unholy urges to passers-by. Meanwhile, the monasteries grow louder. Preachers paint vivid images of angels weeping as sinners lock hands in lustful embraces. One particularly dramatic friar describes the plague as the smoke of God's fury rising from the burned beds of adulterers. He says this while glaring directly at a woman whose only crime appears to be breathing while attractive. You start noticing how many stories are turning up that end in celibacy, or death. Tragic lovers separated forever. Betrothed couples who agree to wait until the plague is over, only for one of them to be struck down before the wedding night. There's even a tale of two young men who took a vow of virginity together, believing their purity would grant them immunity. Spoiler, it didn't. But people still pass the story around like it's inspiring. Historical side note. By the mid-1300s, the church's grip on sexuality was already pretty tight. Marital sex was supposed to be purely procreative. Anything outside that narrow scope, including pleasure, enthusiasm, or non-missionary enthusiasm, was frowned upon. The plague just ramped up that anxiety into a full-on cultural panic. Fringe fact? In some towns, people believed that if you even dreamed of sex during the plague, you had to confess it immediately, or risk spontaneous death. A woman in Avignon reportedly had her dreams cleansed by being locked in a room filled with rosemary smoke while a priest shouted psalms at her. Comforting. Now, of course, not everyone buys into the purity panic. There are skeptics, quiet ones mostly. Some say the plague doesn't care if you're celibate. It kills nuns, monks, and virgins just as easily as it takes drunkards and brothel goers. In fact, several convents have been wiped out entirely, which raises a few uncomfortable questions about the whole divine protection theory. And here's a scholarly debate worth pondering. Was this push for celibacy genuinely about health, or just another excuse for moral policing? Some historians argue that the sexual restrictions were a smokescreen, an easy way to blame victims and deflect responsibility. Others suggest that in a weird way, these precautions may have accidentally helped limit certain kinds of contact-based transmission. Back in your room, you find yourself watching the candle again, its glow dancing in the draught. You think about the idea of shutting down that part of yourself, of giving up all physical closeness, even fleeting comfort. Could you really do that? Could anyone? There's a soft knock at your door. You don't move. You don't answer. Whoever it is, they wait a moment, then walk away. And for a long time the silence feels like safety, but it also feels a little like dying. You wake to rain drizzling down the shutters, the soft patter, like fingers tapping a nervous rhythm. The streets outside glisten, but the cobbles aren't clean. The water just mixes with filth, blood, and the remains of yesterday's fear. You drag a rough wool cloak over your shoulders and head to the window. Across the alley, the baker's apprentice, young, sharp-eyed, with hair like straw in sunlight, is scrubbing his front stoop with what's probably his last vinegar rag. He glances up, sees you, and offers the briefest nod. It's the first time you've been acknowledged in days, and weirdly that's what makes it happen. Your stomach flips, not fear, not nausea, something else. Desire, real, inconvenient desire. The kind that pulses through your body before your brain can protest. The very thing the monks warned about. You feel heat rise in your cheeks and think, not now, you absolute idiot. Because guess what? While the sermons are telling everyone to be celibate and pure, there's a whole other school of thought that says the opposite. That lust might actually be medicinal. And you're starting to see why. So here's the thing. Buried in those thick, handwritten medical texts with names like De Balantiae Corporis and Consilia Sanitatis, are a few voices, small and cautious, arguing that sexual pleasure may serve a purpose during plague times, not just to scratch an itch, but to literally heal the soul. One influential doctor, let's call him the rebel physician, wrote that a joyful spirit strengthens the heart, and since fear and sadness were considered plague triggers, then surely anything that lifted your mood was protective, even, yes, a good roll in the hay. You remember hearing about it in the marketplace? A merchant woman claimed her husband hadn't fallen ill even once because she kept him regularly light of heart. People laughed, but then nodded. A few days later, half her neighbours were trying the same thing. Quietly behind bolted doors, passion was being used as medicine. Another theory, the kind that would absolutely get you excommunicated if you said it too loud, suggested that sexual release was like letting off steam, literally. That if you didn't allow your body to vent its excess humours, they'd stagnate, turning into toxic sludge that would feed disease. One text even warned against becoming too gummed with seed, which sounds gross and also terrifyingly unclear. In towns where doctors leaned toward this theory, there were whispers of a new kind of advice: have sex occasionally but carefully, no excess, no acrobatics, just moderate intimacy. Think of it like medieval cardio. A priest in Cologne was quietly passing out little scrolls that read, "Better to spend the night in warmth and cheer than to face death cold and alone." He was later reassigned. Let's get into the fringe here. In one case from northern Italy, a physician actually recommended sex with someone who had already survived the plague, because they were considered blessed and cleansed. Immune lovers, they were called, like magical unicorns with a very good timing. It became the ultimate flex. I survived the Black Death, and I'm good in bed. But the confusion didn't stop there. In some regions, women were believed to benefit more from sex than men during plague years. Why? Because it was thought that female bodies accumulated excess moisture and cold humours, which could be dispersed by sexual activity. In other words, if a woman didn't have sex, she risked growing poisonous inside. It's both hilarious and horrifying, and of course it opened the door for men to frame their desires as generous public service. On the flip side, other physicians warned that female desire itself could spread plague, that the act of arousal created an invisible mist, a kind of emotional miasma that carried illness through the air. So now you're both dangerous and contagious, just for feeling something. Great. It's hard to know what to believe. Some people cling to the safe sex equals safe heart theory like it's scripture. Others just want to feel something besides fear. You hear of people meeting in shadowy corners, not for passion, but for survival, holding each other, breathing together, even for just a moment, pretending that they're still human. Then there are the poems. Oh yes, plague erotica. You stumble upon a small hand-copied booklet hidden in the lining of a butcher's apron. It's scandalous, hilarious, and unexpectedly touching. It tells of two lovers who meet in the ruins of a burned chapel, speak not a word, and kiss with such intensity that the walls crumble further. In the final verse, they collapse together in the hay, and by morning both are alive. Cured by the sweat of love, it reads. Completely unscientific, also deeply romantic. Let's talk about open scholarly debate for a moment. Historians can't agree on whether plague-era intimacy was driven by genuine belief in sex as medicine, or if it was more of a YOLO situation. Some argue that increased reports of promiscuity were exaggerated by moralists who wanted to shame people into repentance. Others say that people genuinely lost their minds in the face of extinction, and with no future guaranteed, they simply let go of restraint. And here's the other thing. In some areas, this lust as medicine logic crept into official documents. Not openly, but between the lines. You'd see suggestions like, keep the spirit joyful, avoid sorrow, laugh when you can, or seek companionship in dark hours. If you knew how to read between the ink blots, it was practically an invitation. But joy is dangerous. It makes you visible, and in times like this, visibility is risky, so you keep your feelings quiet. You pretend the apprentice across the alley is just a neighbour, nothing more. You convince yourself that the longing in your chest is indigestion, but it isn't. It's heat, life, something that still burns even while the world goes cold. And tonight, you light a single candle and imagine what it would be like to forget everything. The bells, the sermons, the bile and blood, just for an hour. Maybe it wouldn't heal you, but maybe it would remind you that you're still here. Still warm. Still wanting. By now, you've learned to sniff the air the way a sailor watches the sky, trying to catch the shift before the storm hits. Today, the air is heavy, not just with the usual rot and ash and something like boiled cabbage, but with tension. The kind of tension that makes even the birds sound nervous. You glance at the sky, flat grey, no wind. You feel like you're living inside a damp wool blanket. You step outside and head toward the well. A few neighbours hover nearby, careful not to make eye contact. Everyone has a scarf or a veil over their mouth, and even though you know it doesn't really help, you pull yours tighter anyway. It's become more of a habit than a precaution, like whispering prayers under your breath every time you pass the church. As you walk, you hear snippets of conversation, people arguing again about how the disease spreads. The air, someone says. No, the blood, says another. It's the touch, I'm telling you. She slept with a man who'd buried a body and dropped dead 2 days later. You don't even flinch at stories like that anymore. They're too common. And that brings us to one of the more infuriating but fascinating ideas of the age, that plague was caused, worsened, or somehow manipulated by hot air and cold humours. Specifically, that your internal balance, your mix of body fluids and temperature, could determine whether the Black Death found you or passed you by. It's called humoral theory, and it is pretty much the foundation of medieval medicine. You've got 4 main fluids sloshing around inside you. Blood, hot and wet, yellow bile, hot and dry, black bile, cold and dry, and phlegm, cold and wet. Sound a little made up? Well, yes, but it was taken incredibly seriously. Every physical and emotional state was thought to be caused by an imbalance of these 4 elements. Melancholy, too much black bile, nosebleed, excess blood, that gross sensation you get after eating spoiled eel stew, you don't even want to know. So where does sex fit into all this? Well, it throws everything into chaos, depending on whom you ask. Some physicians believe that sex overheated the body, disrupting the carefully calibrated balance of humours. For men especially, orgasm was thought to cause an outflow of vital fluids, weakening your core heat and leaving you vulnerable to outside infection. Others countered that sex allowed the body to expel harmful buildup, especially phlegm and black bile, and therefore acted like a natural purge. If that sounds like someone desperately trying to justify getting laid, you're not wrong. A doctor named Gentile de Foligno, one of the big names of the time, wrote in his plague treatise that excess heat in the body caused blood to boil, generating corruption that attracted disease. He advised cold baths, mint leaves, and no sexual activity whatsoever. He also died of the plague. So maybe don't listen to Gentile. But here's where it gets even weirder. Some people thought that the air itself, the kind that carried smells, emotions, and apparently death, could influence your body's humours. Bad smells were believed to disrupt your inner harmony. A whiff of sewage might throw your black bile into overdrive. A sniff of incense could restore your phlegm. That's why plague doctors pack their beaked masks with rose petals, cloves, and dried lavender. They were trying to filter the miasma, or bad air, that was supposedly poisoning people from the outside in. Of course, miasma theory doesn't hold up now. We know it wasn't airborne poison, but fleas on rats, and poor sanitation. But at the time, it made sense. People noticed that those who lived near swamps or worked with the dead got sick more often, and anything that smelled foul was treated like a carrier of sin and sickness. That included sex. Passionate encounters made you sweat, breathe heavier, exhale heat. That heat, some claimed, could infect the very air around you. So now you're dealing with this double bind. If you don't have sex, your humours stagnate. If you do, you expel too much heat and attract death. Either way, you lose. You pass an herbalist on the street. She's older, wrapped in furs that are far too heavy for summer. She waves you over and tries to sell you a bundle of heat-balancing herbs. Chamomile, sage, something that looks like burnt grass. You buy it, because why not? She adds a whispered warning in. If your blood runs too warm, death slips in unnoticed. There's another layer to all this, of course. Gender. Women were thought to be naturally colder and wetter than men. Stop giggling, it was science back then. This supposedly made them more prone to certain illnesses, but also more resistant to others. Some believe that because women retained their sexual fluids instead of expelling them, thanks for that, 1300s anatomy, their internal balance remained more stable after intercourse. Others argued that women needed sex more frequently to stay cleansed. You don't envy the medieval woman trying to navigate that nonsense. One physician's advice: a wife should receive her husband's warmth no more than twice weekly, lest she dry out her internal organs. Another claimed the opposite. Too little pleasure leads to womb agitation. And people wonder why everyone was so stressed out. Let's pause for a fringe fact. Some cities employed smoke chambers as makeshift clinics. People were instructed to sit in sealed rooms filled with aromatic smoke, think rosemary, frankincense, sulphur, and occasionally opium, until they sweated profusely. This was believed to restore humoral balance and purify the air in your lungs. A few enterprising couples figured out that these chambers also made great places for illicit hookups, since the thick smoke provided both privacy and a built-in excuse for being overheated. Scholarly debate time. Historians still argue whether humoral theory truly shaped people's day-to-day behaviour, or if it mostly influenced the writings of the elite. Some say the average person followed their gut, or their desires, no matter what the doctors scribbled in Latin. Others argue that these theories filtered down through sermons, healers, and community elders, slowly shifting how people saw their own bodies. In either case, the concept of balance, of warm versus cold, wet versus dry, haunted every intimate decision. Back in your room, you lay the herbs on the windowsill. The rain has stopped, and the air smells vaguely like burned wood and mint. You unlace your collar, trying to breathe easier. The heat in your chest, desire, fear, or some messy mix of both, hasn't gone away. You wonder if it ever really will. You're standing at the threshold of your door, the wood damp from the recent rain, when the midwife passes by. She's wrapped in layers of linen that flap around her legs like the wings of a nervous bird. A basket hooked in one elbow, and a copper charm pinned to her chest. You nod as she limps past. She doesn't speak, just meets your eyes with something between suspicion and sympathy, and keeps moving. She's been busy. Too busy. The last 3 homes she visited all have shutters nailed shut now. You don't ask. You've been thinking about women a lot lately. Not just because you're lonely, though sure that too, but because everyone's been whispering about the role of women's bodies in all this madness. Depending on who you ask, the womb is either a holy shield against death or a chaotic cauldron of disease. Welcome to medieval gynecology, where actual science takes a long, slow vacation and leaves superstition in charge. So let's talk wombs. In the 1300s, the female body is a source of mystery, fear, and a shocking amount of misinformation. The uterus is believed to be a kind of floating organ, a creature almost that can wander around the body, causing hysteria if it gets bored or lonely. Some texts suggest it can migrate all the way up to the throat. That's right, your womb might strangle you if you don't keep it satisfied. Charming. During plague years, this theory got a dangerous remix. Some physicians claimed that women's bodies, particularly their reproductive systems, played a direct role in either spreading or suppressing disease. The logic? A woman who was too open, that is, having sex frequently or menstruating excessively, might release pestilent vapours. Others said the opposite, that women who were not sexually active became clogged, and their pent-up humours fermented into poison. It's lose-lose. Either you're too closed or too open, and the plague doesn't care which, it's coming for you anyway. Midwives, of course, knew better. Most weren't literate, but they carried centuries of oral knowledge passed down from mother to daughter. They understood the rhythms of the body, the signs of illness, the herbs that eased pain or calmed an agitated womb. They also understood the emotional side, the way fear twisted everything, how grief made the belly seize, how touch could heal in ways no physician would admit. But they were also targets. With every new death, someone needed to blame someone else, and midwives, with their knowledge of sex, birth and blood, made convenient scapegoats. You hear the rumours daily that a woman in Prague was hanged after someone claimed she breathed disease onto an infant during delivery, that a village near Bruges locked their midwife in a cellar and starved her, convinced she had called the pestilence with unclean words. It makes you sick, but it also makes you wonder how many women have had to pretend not to know what they know, just to survive. There's another theory floating around, more fringe than most. Some so-called experts believed that sexual energy in women was like a magnet for disease, that their heat, yes, women had their own kind of sexual fire, acted as a beacon for the plague. Think of it like medieval radar, drawing illness to them and anyone they touched. As a result, some cities issued actual bans on women travelling alone, particularly widows and prostitutes, fearing they'd carry heat from one quarter to the next. But it wasn't just fear. There were also those quiet rebels, the healers with calloused hands and hidden books, who believed women's bodies had a kind of built-in resilience, that their cycles, their blood, their ability to create life gave them an intuitive understanding of sickness and survival. It's not a coincidence that some of the only people who regularly touched the sick were women. They were there for the births and the deaths and every leaking, sweating, gasping moment in between. And no one gave them credit. Historical fact here, in many medieval towns, midwives were among the few who had real hands-on medical training. They knew how to bind wounds, deliver breech births, treat fevers with their poultices and wine. Yet when the plague arrived, male physicians, many of whom had never even seen a naked woman, began accusing them of sorcery and spiritual corruption. The church started cataloguing midwives' errors, including the use of herbs, the comfort of touch, and worst of all, speaking while attending a delivery. Apparently words could spoil a soul mid-birth. Who knew? You pass the apothecary's stall on your way back home. He's got a new display, wax figures representing the human body's hot spots, with pins stuck in places that make you wince. Balance your fire, the sign reads. You stare at a female form covered in beeswax pustules and feel a flicker of rage. It's not medicine. It's theatre. And bad theatre at that. Let's get into the scholarly debate. Some argue that the obsession with women's reproductive systems during the plague was more about social control than genuine belief. That the fear of the wandering womb of female heat was really just fear of women having power, knowledge, agency, touch. Others suggest that people truly believed what they were saying, even if it sounds absurd now. In a world with no microscopes, no understanding of germs, and an endless parade of dying bodies, maybe blaming the mysterious curves of the female form felt oddly comforting. You return home and sit by the window. The rain started again, tapping out a rhythm like a heartbeat on the sill. Across the alley, the apprentice is there again, this time kneeling, scrubbing the stone with grim determination. You catch his eye. He pauses, then gives a small, tired smile. You smile back, not for him, for you. For the fact that even now your body still feels things, still aches, still remembers what it means to be alive. And that might be the real rebellion. That night, the fever dreams return and you lie in a tangle of wool blankets, sweating from a heat that isn't entirely yours. In the dream, your skin is a map of candle wax, and someone's tracing the edges, whispering things you can't quite hear. When you wake, you're flushed, your mouth dry, and you're left with one vivid image. A woman cloaked in red, surrounded by black smoke, lifting a silver bowl to the sky. You don't know what it means, but the feeling clings to you like oil on your skin. It's no wonder. Lately people are saying strange things about menstruation, things that sound more like curses than medical advice. Depending on who's talking, a bleeding woman is either a walking antidote to the plague, or its cause. You hear it first from a butcher's wife, mouth still stained with gooseberry wine, who leans in and hisses, "Menstrual blood scares off the Black Death." Then later that same day, a passing monk mutters, "Her monthly rot feeds the demon." You don't know what to believe, so you start paying attention. Turns out there's a whole grotesque buffet of medieval opinions on this topic. Some physicians believed that menstruation was the body's way of purging toxins, that women had this natural defense built in, literally bleeding out the bad stuff. A few bold thinkers even argued that menstrual blood could neutralize poison, and in some cases, treat plague real big wounds. One text suggests smearing it on the skin as a kind of plague repellent. Yes, that was a real thing. So by that logic, women who were still menstruating were safer. Cleaner in a twisted backwards way, but not for long, because a bigger crowd of scholars, men of course, whose only experience with periods was fear and confusion, argued that menstrual blood was inherently corrupt, that it was in fact a breeding ground for pestilence. They claimed that when a woman bled, her body released vapours, foul airs they called them, that poisoned anyone nearby. These vapours could seep into the floorboards, curl around doorknobs, hover over food. And that brings you to one of the cruelest ironies of the time. Women who got sick during their cycle were often assumed to be the cause of the illness itself. Not just unlucky, guilty. If a man caught the plague after sleeping next to a menstruating woman, she could be accused of murder by menses. You think about that the next time you pass a boarded-up house with a single red handprint smeared on the door. You're not sure if it's symbolic or literal, probably both. Midwives again tried to speak sense. They'd seen enough cycles, enough births, enough illness to know what was superstition and what was simply nature, but their voices were drowned out by preachers and physicians eager to label women's bodies as unstable, chaotic, dangerous. The womb, they said, was ruled by the moon, and the moon, as everyone knew, was fickle and mad. A fringe belief takes it even further. In some parts of Germany and to Bohemia, People whispered that the plague was the punishment for centuries of ignoring the red gospel, an imagined prophecy written in menstrual blood. It sounds absurd now, but in desperate times, anything wrapped in mystery gains power. A group of women in one village was said to have gathered each new moon to burn their linen cloths and chant psalms, trying to purify the land. The entire village vanished from the map weeks later. Some say the plague got them, others say the authorities did. Meanwhile, in towns where the period as purifier theory took hold, certain women were treated like living talismans. You hear about one such woman in northern France. She was brought into the town square, blindfolded, and told to walk the perimeter of the market bleeding barefoot as people watched and prayed. She fainted halfway through. A few weeks later, the town's infection rate dropped, and they named her St. Marianne of the Crimson Step. You're not making this up. Here's your historical fact. In the 14th century, menstruation was so poorly understood that some doctors thought it was the body's way of releasing excess brain heat. Others thought it was spoiled milk that hadn't made it to the breasts. Diagrams from that time show the female reproductive system as a tangled mess of tubes leading nowhere. Basically, plumbing designed by a poet in the middle of a breakdown. You read somewhere that women were warned not to bathe during their periods, or they might lock the poisons inside. You imagine being told you're both too dirty to touch and too fragile to cleanse. It's enough to make you scream, but you don't. You just chew your bread and keep your mouth shut like everyone else who doesn't want to be turned into a symbol. And yes, there's a scholarly debate about all this. Some modern historians argue that these views on menstruation were a symptom of broader anxieties about sex, disease, and the body's betrayal. Others suggest that the period panic was a deliberate tool of oppression, a way to keep women quiet, isolated, and ashamed. The truth, probably, is that it was both. Fear makes monsters out of normal things. Blood becomes a curse. A cycle becomes a hex. You watch the women at the well now. You see how they shift slightly when someone coughs nearby. How they hold their cloaks tighter if a man stands too close. You wonder how many are menstruating right now and hiding it like a loaded weapon. And then you think of the red-cloaked woman from your dream. The silver bowl. The smoke. You wonder if she was a midwife, or a witch, or just another body trying to survive the plague with nothing but instinct and a heartbeat and the unbearable burden of being born female in the wrong century. Outside, the bell tolls again. You've stopped counting. It's easier that way. The next morning, the priest is shouting again. He's taken to standing on a crate in the middle of the square, arms raised like he's waiting for a lightning strike, spewing fire and brimstone at anyone who'll listen. You don't want to stop, but his voice cuts through the air like a rusty blade. Repent, renounce the pleasures of the flesh. You have brought this pestilence upon yourselves. People gather, mostly out of boredom, maybe fear that if they don't show up, they'll be next. You hang at the edge of the crowd, arms crossed, and watch him work himself into a sweat. His hair is plastered to his forehead, his eyes wild. He doesn't blink. You half expect him to start levitating. What he's preaching today isn't just fear, it's full-on sexual paranoia. He calls lust the worm in the apple, the sin that gnaws from the inside out. He claims the plague is God's punishment for unclean unions, for stolen kisses, for thoughts that wander after dark. Then he points to a woman in the front row. You don't know her, but her face goes pale. He accuses her of lustful glances toward a man she isn't married to. The crowd shifts, uneasy. She says nothing, just stands there with her hands clenched into white fists. She's lucky it stops there, because in many places it doesn't. During plague times, the church's fixation on sexual sin reaches a fever pitch. Every cough becomes a consequence. Every body is suspect. And the only thing worse than dying is dying guilty, so the message gets louder, meaner. Sin is not just personal, it's contagious. The logic goes like this. If one person gives in to lust, it spreads like smoke. Their corruption leaks out in whispers, in touch, in breath. Their pleasure infects the air. Suddenly an entire street is coughing. It's not disease, it's divine wrath. All because someone couldn't keep their hands to themselves. So the church prescribes a cure. Suffering, not the poetic kind either. We're talking real blood and blisters suffering. Mortification of the flesh. If your body wants something forbidden, you punish it until it learns not to ask again. Whip yourself, sleep on a bed of broken straw, starve yourself until your skin hangs loose. One popular method is wearing an iron chain around the thigh. Tight enough to hurt, not tight enough to kill. Pain keeps you alert. Pain keeps you pure. And sex? Forget it. Married or not, if you're still doing it during a plague, you're dancing with the devil. There are accounts of couples being forced to confess their marital excesses in front of their entire parish. One particularly stern bishop required newlyweds to take a public vow of celibacy for 6 months to ensure their union was not carnal, but sacred. So, honeymoon cancelled. A widow in Avignon was accused of inciting the plague because she remarried too quickly and was reportedly too joyful in her new role. She disappeared the next week. No one talks about it, but everyone remembers. Then there are the penitents. They come into town like ghosts in chains, barefoot, draped in rags. They chant and sob and whip themselves in the middle of the street. Blood splatters on cobblestones. Some people join them out of fear, others out of guilt. A few join because they're honestly into it, which is a whole other problem. But their message is simple. Pleasure is the enemy. Fringe fact. In some towns, especially across Germany and southern France, there were public confessionals where people were encouraged to speak aloud their sexual sins. Not in private booths, right there in the square. One man reportedly confessed to unwholesome thoughts about a merchant's donkey, and the priest told him to sleep in a pig pen for 3 nights. You wish that were a joke. Now, let's talk about the erotic punishments. Because yes, those exist. In some truly unhinged corners of Europe, punishments for lust took on a strangely theatrical tone, like forcing accused adulterers to wear phallic-shaped hats or have their clothing painted with images of flames and naked bodies. It's medieval slut-shaming with a side of interpretive art. There's a scholarly debate too. Some historians argue that all this fiery preaching about lust and punishment was less about protecting souls and more about enforcing control, in a time when everything, food, safety, even sunlight, felt unpredictable. The church doubled down on what it could dominate: sex and the human body. Others suggest the hysteria was sincere. People were terrified, and fear makes zealots of us all. If death is random, then rules become a comfort, even cruel ones. Back in your room, you light a stub of candle and sit by the tiny mirror hung crooked on the wall. You stare at your own reflection, thinking of the priest's sermon. Have you sinned? Sure, everyone has. Have you enjoyed it? Sometimes, and now you wonder if joy itself is the real crime. But here's the truth. No one knows anything. The plague doesn't check to see if you're a virgin. It doesn't spare the pure or strike only the damned. You've seen holy men die screaming and thieves survive unscathed. The body count doesn't care how pious you were. It just climbs. So why all the shouting? Why the punishments, the self-flagellation, the vows of silence and celibacy? Maybe it's about control or distraction. Or maybe, just maybe, it's because suffering feels like the only power left. When you can't fight the disease, at least you can fight yourself. The wind changes. A low howl snakes down the alley. Somewhere someone sobs. Somewhere else laughter. And you exhale. You're still here. Still unpunished, at least for now. The next morning you hear them before you see them. A sound like a wave of insects, soft and rhythmic. Snap, 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 growing louder as it approaches. You step out into the alley, and there they are, the flagellants. A procession of men with bare, bleeding backs, robes tied loosely at the waist, eyes rolled toward the heavens as they whip themselves in unison. Blood spatters on the cobblestones with each strike. They chant in a low dismal dirge, Latin words soaked in desperum. People stand on their doorsteps, watching in silence, not out of respect, out of fear. The first time you saw them, you thought it was some kind of protest. Now you know better. It's a moving confession, a travelling punishment, a grotesque performance that blurs the line between religion, self-harm, and something darker. And it's catching on. Flagellant movement spread like wildfire through plague-struck towns. The logic is simple. If chilling, God is angry. We are sinful. Our only hope is to suffer more than he would make us suffer. So they march from town to town, stripping their backs with iron-tipped cords, reciting prayers, singing hymns, and sometimes, yes, dropping dead from infection or exhaustion. It's devotion through agony. But there's another layer to it, one no one really talks about out loud. The strange sensuality of it all. You notice it immediately. The exposed skin slick with sweat. The groans. The rhythm of the whips. There's a trance-like quality to the way the men move. almost like dancers caught in a beat they can't break. You aren't the only one noticing. You catch more than a few eyes watching with an expression that's not just reverence, it's something else, something complicated. This is the uncomfortable truth. Suffering, when performed in public, becomes spectacle. And spectacle, no matter how painful, draws desire. There's something undeniably charged about these rituals. The way pain and discipline and flesh intertwine. The way spiritual purity starts to look suspiciously like erotic theatre. You hear whispers in the marketplace. A woman confesses she dreams of one of the flagellants, shirtless and weeping, offering penance to the sky. A man claims he saw two of them in a barn after nightfall, comforting each other in ways that don't show up in the Gospels. The church hears these rumours too, and suddenly the flagellants aren't holy anymore. They're dangerous, and historical fact, in 1349, Pope Clement VI officially condemned the flagellant movement, declaring it heretical and prone to corruption. Reports have begun surfacing that the groups weren't just self-punishing, they were becoming lawless. They disrupted towns, rejected the authority of local clergy, and yes, indulged in improper conduct. There were stories of secret rituals, of communal nudity, of moments where suffering turned into something else entirely. Fringe fact, some flagellant groups developed coded hand signals to indicate when it was safe to stop whipping and start praying, or in certain circles, to disappear into side alleys for recovery. You read that in a tattered letter passed between two friars. Most of it was censored with soot, but a few choice words remained. Heat, flesh, forgiveness in the dark. The lines get blurrier the more you look. Pain as purification, yes, but also pain as permission. In a world where pleasure is forbidden, where bodies are suspect, suffering becomes the only socially acceptable way to feel something. And once you've given yourself over to sensation, who's to say where penance ends and indulgence begins? The irony, of course, is that many of these self-proclaimed holy men end up just as sick as those they march past. Some die in the street mid-procession. Others collapse in barns, their wounds infected, their faith outpaced by fever. And still the line marches on, believing that with enough blood they can outpace death. There's a scholarly debate about all this, naturally. Were the erotic undertones intentional? Some historians argue it was subconscious, that the intensity of physical ritual naturally triggered repressed desires. Others believe it was deliberate, a kind of unspoken release valve in a world strangled by repression. The truth, as always, is somewhere in the muddy middle. Back at home, you can't shake the image. The man in the front row of the procession, the way he looked skyward, lips parted, blood running down his spine like ink on parchment. There was something hypnotic about it. Something unholy, maybe, or something deeply human. You sit by your fireless hearth and think about all the things no one says. The hunger for connection, even when it comes wrapped in shame. The way pain and pleasure tangle when the world gives you no other outlet. The way, in the absence of touch, even suffering begins to feel like intimacy. That night, the streets are quiet again. The rain has returned, soaking the bloodstains into the earth. You lie awake, not from fear, but from something else entirely. A thrum under your skin, a kind of haunted yearning. You close your eyes, and for a moment you imagine what it might feel like to be seen, even if only while kneeling, even if only while bleeding. The storm outside rumbles low, and in the silence after the thunder, you think you hear chanting. But maybe that's just your heart calling for something it's not allowed to name. The brothel on Candle Alley used to have music. You remember it vaguely. Laughter spilling from the windows, the clink of glasses, the flutter of silk dresses in the late evening breeze. That was before the plague hit hard, before the shutters closed, before someone painted a black X on the door in thick, dripping tar. Now it's silent, dark and shuttered like a tomb. But last night you swear you saw a figure slip inside, a flicker of movement, a shadow where there shouldn't be one. And this morning a bundle of dried lavender lies on the doorstep. Someone's still tending the place, or at least remembering it. Because even now, with half the town buried or barricaded, the question of brothels lingers, strange, murky and deeply divisive. Should they be shut down to stop the spread of plague, or left open to keep tempers cool, hearts distracted, and men's blood circulating properly, as one physician awkwardly put it? Here's the thing. Brothels were legal in many parts of Europe in the 1300s. They were regulated, taxed, even blessed in bizarre backhanded ways by the church, which preferred organised sin to chaotic temptation. As long as it was out of sight and followed the rules, no sex on holy days, no public flaunting, no touching the clergy, it was tolerated, encouraged even. Better a man pay for release than seduce someone's wife. But when the plague came, the whole system got murky. The first response? Well, shut them down. Prostitution, already treated like a necessary evil, quickly became a suspected vector. People began to believe that lust was not only immoral but infectious, that the body heat from sex could stoke the fires of plague within, and worse, spread it from client to client, bed to bed, moan to moan. Some cities ordered all brothels to be sealed. Others went further, arresting sex workers, evicting them, forcing them to leave town entirely, and of course it didn't work. Lust doesn't die just because the streets are empty. In fact, it gets louder in the silence. Secret brothels popped up everywhere, in back rooms of bakeries, in tavern lofts, in the haylofts of barns just outside the city walls. The brothel became a kind of underground sanctuary, a place where people sought not just pleasure but human contact, warmth, distraction, defiance. Sex, in plague time, became both an escape and a rebellion. Some healers surprisingly backed this up. They argued that regular intercourse, especially for men, helped loosen the bodily tensions that trap vapours. One particularly bold Italian physician wrote that a man kept too long in abstinence invites pestilence into the folds of his loins. That's an actual quote, and maybe the most uncomfortable turn of phrase ever written. But others weren't buying it. Rumours swirled that prostitutes were disease carriers, that their sweat, their breath, even their sighs could transmit the plague. One woman was accused of sighing pestilence into 5 noblemen. She was burned, her ashes mixed with quicklime and dumped in the river. And yet people kept visiting, secretly, desperately. You heard of one nobleman who visited the same woman every week, always after sunset, always in disguise. When he died of the plague, his servants swore they found a note tucked inside his boot that read, "Her touch was worth the risk." Fringe fact, some sex workers took to wearing amulets to protect their clients. Tiny linen sachets filled with rosemary, clove, and crushed pearls, stitched into garters or tucked into corsets. One brothel even had its own protection charm, a carved phallus made of polished bone, passed between workers like a relic. They called it St. Gaspar. Scholarly debate on this topic is fierce. Some historians argue that brothels were unfairly scapegoated, that sex workers became convenient targets for a society unravelling at the seams. Others suggest that these women were, strangely, some of the most informed about hygiene. Many insisted on washing before and after sessions, used rudimentary versions of protection, and even created their own quarantine routines, long before the term existed. There's even a recorded case in Paris where a group of prostitutes pooled their savings to hire a private physician, who taught them how to identify early plague symptoms in clients and when to refuse service. A proto-union of plague-savvy workers, doing more for public health than half the city council. You sit near the abandoned brothel now, watching the window shutters sway slightly in the breeze. You can almost hear laughter from a memory that doesn't belong to you. You imagine the velvet drapes, the perfume thick in the air, the feel of skin on skin under flickering candlelight. Not just sex, but company, attention, a reason to pretend that tomorrow still exists. And here's a truth no one says aloud. Brothels, in their own twisted way, kept the city from exploding. When fear ruled everything, they offered a place where rules were briefly suspended, where desire was not a sin, but a symptom of still being human, where you could touch without guilt, even if only for the length of a single feverish night. You wonder what happened to the women inside, where they went, who they touched last, whether they lit candles and whispered prayers before every client, or if they simply sighed and got on with it, whether they believed they were healers, sinners, or just surviving in the only way they knew. The wind picks up. A shutter claps once against the wall, then settles. You stand and walk away, but you don't forget. You don't look back. Because in a world obsessed with punishment, they chose to offer pleasure. And that, more than anything, made them dangerous. By mid-afternoon, the air feels heavy again, not just from the heat, but from the tension that's been tightening the seams of the town like a too small tunic. The carts roll by with fewer bodies now, not because the plague has slowed, but because so many are gone, there are fewer left. To die. You count 5 boarded up doors just walking to the bakery. One has a dried sprig of yarrow nailed over it. The plant's supposed to ward off evil, or maybe illness, or maybe just the fear of it. Doesn't seem to be working. And as always, when things get desperate, the whispers get crueler. Today the rumours are about the peasants, their bodies, their desires, and their so-called reckless lust. The blame game has found a new target, and this time it's not the brothels or the priests or even the midwives. It's the people at the bottom, the ones who still laugh loudly, drink heavily, and apparently love too freely. You overhear it near the well. A merchant mutters to his companion. They spread it like animals, filthy bodies, always rutting in the hay. Another nods solemnly. They don't have discipline. They don't fear God. You feel your stomach turn, not from hunger this time, from disgust. Because it's not true, not all of it anyway. Sure, some of the labourers and farmers keep living as they always have, eating, loving, touching, without ceremony. But is that sin or survival? When the plague comes for you without reason, isn't joy a kind of resistance? Still, the stories spread like mould, that peasants copulate in the fields under the full moon to fertilise the earth, that they drink aphrodisiac mead and throw death-defying orgies in empty barns, that they take no precautions, have no morals, and that their looseness, not just of tongue but of trousers, is to blame for the second wave of death. You hear a friar say, "The poor are like firewood, always smouldering, always ready to spark." He says it with pity, but it doesn't land that way. It's a warning. Historical fact, in the wake of the Black Death, class tensions exploded. With so many labourers dead, the survivors were suddenly in higher demand. Wages rose, peasants gained leverage, and that made the nobility nervous. Painting the lower classes as morally diseased was a convenient way to keep them in their place. Lust became the excuse, the plague the consequence. And let's be honest, there's always been discomfort with the idea of poor people having pleasure. Too many believe that if you didn't have wealth, you didn't deserve joy. That if your body bore the grime of work, it had no business feeling desire. And yet, those were the same bodies that kept the bread baked, the streets swept, the dead buried. You think of old man Sylvain and his wife Emmeline. They've lived at the edge of town for years. He digs graves now, 3, sometimes 4 a day. She cooks for the children whose parents are gone. They still hold hands when they walk, still smile in that quiet, exhausted way that says, "I remember you before the world changed." You see them and think, if that's sin, maybe sin's not such a bad thing. Of course there were wild nights too. You hear about the miller's barn where couples slip in and out like ghosts. No names, no promises, just skin, breath, and the knowledge that any moment could be the last. One survivor wrote in his diary, "We feared nothing more than loneliness, so we clung to each other like vines in a storm." That feels true. Raw and true. But here's a fringe twist for you. Some towns tried to legislate morality by class. In a little corner of Flanders, officials once passed an ordinance that forbade peasants from gathering in groups larger than 4 after sundown, especially if they were drinking. One clause actually used the phrase to prevent lustful disobedience. There were patrols sent to barns and vineyards, checking for, well, let's just say they weren't looking for wine thieves. The idea was that uncontrolled sexual behaviour among the lower classes wasn't just indecent, it was dangerous, contagious, even revolutionary. If the peasants could make their own choices about their bodies, what else might they want to choose? You see the logic. It's ugly, but familiar. Make pleasure seem dirty, and you can keep power. Tell people that their joy is a risk to the community, and they'll police each other. They'll hide, hush, and suffer in silence. Here's where the scholars get tangled. Some argue that the so-called sexual frenzy of the lower classes was largely invented, an exaggerated scapegoat to justify crackdowns and keep social order. Others believe there really were pockets of rebellion, fueled not just by lust but by rage, that people who'd been silenced, taxed, beaten and starved finally said, "Screw it. If death is coming, let's at least go down laughing." And maybe they did. You watch the fields now, the golden crops swaying in the late summer breeze. You know that somewhere out there, under the cover of tall grass and a rising moon, 2 people might be tangled together, whispering each other's names like prayers. Not because they're reckless, because they're alive. Back in your room, you stare at the ceiling again. You've never cared about class or status, not really. All of that feels silly when you're scrubbing sores from your own arms. But now you understand something deeper. This plague doesn't just kill bodies, it kills the right to feel good in your body, to hold someone, to want. And for some, that's the cruelest part of all. You hear him before you see him, the soft jingle of bells stitched into the hem of his robe, the deliberate, unhurried clack of boots on the cobblestone. Then the scent hits you, rosewater, vinegar, clove, and finally the figure rounds the corner like some dreadful apparition. Long black coat, wide-brimmed hat, gloves like the hands of a marionette, and that beaked mask. Blank-eyed, grotesque, and somehow more unsettling than the sickness itself. A plague doctor, one of the few people in town who's paid to get close to the dying. You shrink back as he passes. Everyone does. He doesn't stop, he never does. You don't even know his name. What you do know is this. The beak isn't just for show. It's packed with herbs, lavender, mint, myrrh, and sometimes camphor, meant to purify the air he breathes. They think the plague rides on miasma, on the stench of decay and sin. The idea is that if he breathes good smells, the bad ones can't get in. It's faulty logic, but then again, everything is these days. And yet these men, these terrifying beaked harbingers, are seen as the last line between life and death. They examine boils, prescribe treatments, write death reports, and in some cases, they give deeply troubling advice about sex. One such doctor, hired by the council of a southern Italian port city, distributed a pamphlet titled Regimen for Protection Against the Pestilence. In it he warns against vigorous motions that stir the inner winds, which is code, of course, for sex. According to him, the act itself creates a vacuum inside the body, a perfect storm of heat and exposure that invites the plague to sneak in through your pores. He recommends abstinence, cold baths, frequent bloodletting, and, get this, a light diet of lentils and melon. Sexy. But he's not alone. Many plague doctors echo the same concerns, that lust weakens the heart, disrupts digestion, and creates an imbalance in the vital airs. Some even go so far as to say that sexual desire is contagious, not just the act but the urge. That being around someone who's aroused can stir your own humours into chaos and open your body to illness. And so begins a truly bizarre chapter of plague medicine, where doctors begin treating not just the plague itself, but libido as a symptom. If you're too interested in sex during a pandemic, they say, something must be wrong with your internal balance. One document suggests cooling herbs like lettuce seed, violet syrup, and crushed pearls to tame the fires of lust. Another prescribes boiled toad water to curb unseemly desire. You try not to think too hard about the toad part. Fringe fact, in one Hungarian town, the local plague doctor reportedly carried around a small cage containing a live lizard. He believed it could detect heat in the blood and would hiss if a patient was too lustful. There's no record of whether the lizard ever hissed, but there is a doodle in the margins of his notebook showing a very smug-looking reptile. And this is where it gets sticky, because while plague doctors were trained, many were also opportunists. Some were charlatans, hired more for their willingness to go near the sick than for any real knowledge. A few exploited the fear around sexuality, offering expensive potions to cool the blood, or charging to purify households where carnal energy was suspected of attracting the plague. There are stories, ugly ones, of doctors accusing women of being plague vectors simply because they were attractive. One woman, Isabeau of Dijon, was reported for possessing a face that tempts sin. Her husband died 2 days after they slept together. The doctor declared she had passed poison through her pores. She was exiled. This kind of rhetoric worked especially well on the anxious and the powerful. Wealthy clients would hire doctors to examine their households not just for symptoms, but for signs of desire. Damp sheets, a flushed servant, a whiff of perfume out of place. It became a whole new kind of paranoia. The fear that pleasure might be hiding somewhere in your home, waiting to ruin everything. The scholarly debate on plague doctors' role in sexual paranoia is fierce. Some argue they were merely reflecting the anxieties of the time, using the best information they had, flawed as it was. Others say they fueled the panic, creating fear where there was none, offering solutions to problems that never existed just to pad their own pockets. Either way, their impact was undeniable. They carried not just medicine and masks, but moral judgment as some moral judgment. You see it now in the way people avoid touching, in how lovers glance at each other, with guilt instead of longing, in the way laughter fades when the doctor walks by. He is the embodiment of the new rules. Don't sweat, don't sigh, don't feel too much. Your survival might depend on staying emotionally neutral. You think about that as you sit in your room later, candle flickering, shadows dancing across the wall. You remember a time, not so long ago, when someone traced a line down your back and you gasped. Not from pain, from being seen. Now, you flinch if someone brushes your hand in passing, and worse, you know why. You wonder what the doctor would say if he knew. If he'd write you off as infected, if he'd mutter about warm blood and inner heat, if he'd offer you a pouch of crushed coral or recommend more cold baths and fewer thoughts. You shake your head. You're tired of being told that your desires are dangerous. Tired of fear pretending it's medicine. Tired of watching the most human parts of you labelled a threat. Outside, the doctor's bells jingle again. Fainter now, he's moved on. But the silence he leaves behind, that sticks. There's something about bad air that sticks to your skin. Not just in the lungs. It clings, it soaks, it worms its way into your pores, or so you're told. It's early evening, and the wind carries a scent that makes your stomach twist. Sweat, decay, herbs burned too long over an open fire. You pull your cloak tighter, as if fabric can protect you from the miasma. That invisible plague fog everyone fears more than death itself. That's the word on everyone's chapped lips. Miasma. It means polluted air, a thick stew of rot, sin and corruption rising up from open graves, latrines and lustful encounters. Not that anyone understands germs yet. Not really. So when they smell something foul, they assume it carries disease, not because it's dirty in the physical sense, but because it's morally charged. The scent of sin, quite literally, hangs in the air. And here's where it gets wild. Sex, they say, is a contributor to bad air. Not just the act itself, but the whole experience, the sweat, the breath, the flushed skin, the release. When two people get caught up in each other, they stir the inner winds, their bodies warm, exhale heat, and together they create a pocket of invisible vapour thick enough to carry illness. At least that's what half the doctors are claiming, and unfortunately that's the half people are listening to. You pass a cart loaded with straw meant for burning. Someone's written a message in charcoal across the side. Clean air, clean soul. You think it's supposed to be inspiring. It feels more like a warning. And so, in a truly unhinged twist of logic, people begin to fear intimacy for its air quality. Kissing becomes dangerous not because of physical contact, but because shared breath is believed to mingle the humours and create heated vapours. Couples are told to sleep in separate beds, with a linen sheet pinned up between them to keep their exhalations apart. Public health officials, if you can call a council of terrified bakers and butchers, that go as far as issuing recommendations about the proper distance to stand from your spouse. And then there's the advice about windows. Keep them open, they say, even in the rain. Air must circulate. Stagnant rooms invite decay. But at the same time, don't sleep near a draught, because external winds may rouse the humours. Basically, the wind can save or kill you depending on its mood that day. You begin to suspect no one actually understands anything. You stumble on an old copy of a medical scroll shoved under your neighbour's door. It's filled with illustrations. Naked bodies outlined in ink, small clouds drawn around their mouths and groins, arrows pointing outwards. One figure is mid-embrace, a swirl of black smoke curling from their bodies like a serpent. In the margin, someone's written, "Do not tempt the air. The air remembers." Let's drop a historical fact here. The theory of miasma dates back to ancient Greece, but it takes on new ferocity during the plague. Cities reek of burning herbs, tar, resin, and, inexplicably, vinegar-soaked rags hung on doorways. People wear pomanders, tiny scented balls, around their necks to ward off stench. Others tie dried flowers under their noses. The rich install indoor fountains or burn rosemary branches just to keep the air moving. Fringe fact. In one town, officials tried to outlaw certain positions during sex, claiming some generated more miasmic force than others. A monk-turned-physician wrote that upright copulation stirs the spirits less than the prone variety, which you're pretty sure is just a fancy way of saying standing up is safer. It's unclear how this was enforced, or measured, or not laughed out of the room. The debate among scholars today is hilarious and bleak. Did people actually believe the air around sex was more dangerous than the act itself? Or was this another layer of psychological control, shaming pleasure by linking it to atmospheric corruption? Some argue that bad air was a metaphor for moral failure. Others say people genuinely believed in physical contamination via lust-charged breezes. You've got to admit, though, it makes a twisted kind of sense. The world feels poisoned. The wind brings death into your home. So why wouldn't they believe desire itself carries a smell, a taint, an afterglow that can choke you days later? You return home and try not to breathe too deeply. You lighted a bundle of dried sage, wave it around the room like a charm. The smoke curls into the corners, smelling more like burnt shoes than purification, but you let it linger. You're not superstitious, but you're also not stupid. Outside, someone's having a fight. Raised voices, slamming wood. You catch a phrase, her scent lingers, she's unclean. Then a crash. You hear crying, not loud, just a small defeated sob, and suddenly it all clicks. The air, the paranoia, the obsession with invisible sins. Miasma is the perfect scapegoat. It's vague, it's everywhere, and it can never be proven wrong. If your lover gets sick, it's not because they were exposed to fleas or filth, it's because you let desire rise in a room that should have been still. You sit on your bed, suddenly aware of every scent. Your own sweat, the musty blanket, the herbal smoke, the faint perfume from a scarf you haven't worn in months. You hold the scarf to your face and inhale deeply. It smells like memory. And just for a second, it feels like comfort. Until your heart skips. Is that feeling warmth or warning? You blow out the candle, and for the first time in weeks, you sleep with the window open, just in case the air decides to forgive you. The next morning you wake to a knock at the door. 3 sharp more raps as the kind that don't wait for permission. You open it to find a boy no older than 12, barefoot, hair plastered to his forehead. He doesn't speak, just holds out a small cloth bundle tied with twine and nods. Inside, a collection of dried herbs, a scrap of parchment with looping, hopeful handwriting, and a tiny glass vial of honey-infused wine. There's also a note, for strength and for love. No signature. It's not the first bundle you've seen. Word has been spreading that someone in town is quietly distributing aphrodisiac cures, not potions to chase away the plague directly, but remedies aimed at restoring vitality and, well, igniting a little passion. The idea is simple. Joy strengthens the heart. And in a time when the heart is under siege, a little passion might just be your best medicine. You've heard whispers of these so-called plague-time love elixirs. They're passed hand to hand, no payment requested, mostly among the desperate and the quietly daring. The ingredients vary, but there are patterns. Honey for sweetness and sweetness, cinnamon for heat, ginger for stimulation, mint to clear the fog from the head, and sometimes something much stranger. One recipe, written in the margin of a church bulletin, calls for ground antler dust, goat's milk, and the dew from a virgin's hair. Another suggests crushing dried rose petals with clove and a dash of rooster blood. A third, offered with alarming confidence by the town apothecary's assistant, insists that a bit of cooked beaver tail boiled with ale can rally even the most sorrow-drenched soul. You're not sure how beaver tail affects libido, but okay. These mixtures are taken in small sips before bed, or right before you climb under the sheets with someone you're not sure it's safe to touch. You're told the point isn't the potion, it's the ritual. The act of preparing something that smells good, tastes warm, and feels like an invitation to remember your body again. Some people are turning these potions into events, quiet gatherings in shuttered rooms, a single candle lit, a shared vial passed in reverent silence. They drink, they breathe, they touch, softly, like people discovering skin for the first time. One couple even hosts healing nights once a week. Just 2 hours, no rules, no shame. You hear about them from a neighbour who came back glowing, the bruise of grief finally loosened from her face. Here's your historical fact. Many herbs now considered basic pantry staples were once prized as aphrodisiacs and plague deterrents. Saffron, for example, was believed to warm the blood and brighten the soul. In fact, demand became so high that saffron thefts turned violent. One shipment was hijacked in transit, and the event triggered what historians now call the Saffron War. People weren't playing around. Fringe fact? In parts of rural Italy, women would sew tiny sachets of so-called lovers' herbs into their corsets. Thyme, anise, and powdered lily root, believing it would draw passion to them, while also warding off illness. These sachets were called cuori rossi, or red hearts, and were sometimes burned in secret when a lover died, as a way of returning the fire. But not everyone loves the idea of lust as pure medicine. Plenty of townsfolk think it's blasphemy. You hear one old man spit at the idea in the square, calling it witchcraft wrapped in perfume. A few churchgoers murmur about pagan healing and the sins of the flesh dressed up as kindness. Someone even went so far as to nail a warning to the tavern wall. Joy is not a cure, it is the cause. And that sparks a deeper debate. Is pleasure ever really safe in times like this? Some argue that it's essential, that to forget desire is to become hollow, brittle, more likely to fall. Others say it's a luxury that tempts fate, that love and lust, even disguised as therapy, are distractions from prayer, from vigilance, from the tightrope everyone's trying to walk between survival and damnation. Scholars still argue about this. Was the distribution of love potions and herbal aphrodisiacs a legitimate coping mechanism during plague years, or a romanticised side effect of desperation? Some believe it was all placebo, a way to feel in control. Others suggest it had real physiological effects. Spices stimulate circulation after all. Warm drinks calm the nervous system. A kiss can lower your pulse. And maybe, just maybe, shared desire can keep the shadows at bay. You stare at the bundle now. The smell is comforting, sweet, earthy, a little sharp at the edges. You take a sip from the glass vial. The wine is warm, the honey thick, and the taste clings to your tongue like memory. Your chest warms instantly, not magic, just sugar and suggestion. But even that's something. That night, you don't dream of fever or death. You dream of hands, gentle, familiar, tracing the shape of your ribs. You wake not afraid, but aching. Not empty, but full. The morning comes softer than usual. Light through this window, the sound of birds that don't know what century it is. You step outside and breathe deep. And for once, the air doesn't smell like vinegar or death. It smells like cinnamon. You're standing outside the apothecary's door when the shouting starts. Inside, someone's hurling jars. You hear the sharp crash of glass, the pop of a corked bottle giving way, and then the unmistakable shriek of a woman's voice cutting through the stale air. You hesitate, then lean closer to the warped wooden door just in some time to catch a heated exchange. "You don't know a woman's body," she cries. "You don't even like women." There's a pause, then a smug male voice replies, "And yet people pay me for my knowledge." You've walked right into the middle of a battle between midwives and male doctors, one that's been simmering just beneath the surface of plague medicine for months now, maybe longer, and in this case it's getting personal. Inside, the midwife, a short, square-shouldered woman named Letta, is red in the face and holding what's left of a broken pestle. Across from her stands the town's youngest physician, a freshly robed university type with perfectly manicured fingers and a mouth that's never once delivered a baby. He's glaring like he just lost a chess match or an ego contest. Letta doesn't back down, she never does, and you've come to admire her for that. While the university men quote Galen and scribble notes in their plague journals, she's out in the mud, elbows deep in reality, delivering babies, treating rashes, setting broken bones, and lately trying to convince people that women's bodies aren't vessels of doom. Because that's what's at stake here. Not just who knows what herbs to grind or how to bind a boil, but who gets to control the narrative around sexuality, medicine, and the female form during a time of mass panic. See, midwives and women healers have long known things that textbooks can't explain. They know when a woman is carrying twins by the way her breath shortens. They know how to coax a breech baby without instruments. They understand that sometimes what looks like madness is just a womb grieving a child lost in blood. But now, with the plague in full swing, their knowledge is being challenged and criminalised. Male physicians, especially those trained in universities, have been stepping into the spotlight. They wear long robes and quote Latin. They offer treatments with impressive names like Aqua Regia or Sanguis Purgatus, and above all, they insist that they are the only ones qualified to speak about the plague's impact on sex and reproduction. Their theories? Often ridiculous. One popular idea is that a woman's womb, when agitated by lust, releases toxins that ferment into disease. Another suggests that too much sex leads to womb migration, again with the wandering uterus nonsense, causing madness, and in some cases, spontaneous combustion. That last part was probably metaphorical, hopefully. Letta, on the other hand, argues that connection is healing. That touch, done gently and with knowledge, can lower fever. That a woman's monthly cycle isn't a curse, but a rhythm that should be respected. That sexuality isn't dangerous, it's natural. It needs care, not suspicion. She doesn't have a diploma, but she has 20 years of experience and blood under her nails. You know whose advice you'd trust more? Fringe fact. Some midwives in the 1300s developed their own coded language to share remedies and reproductive knowledge without attracting unwanted attention. They'd refer to contraception as blessing delay, and aphrodisiacs as marriage cheer. It was a quiet rebellion, a way to pass down wisdom while avoiding charges of witchcraft or corruption. Unfortunately, not everyone appreciated that kind of quiet power. In cities and towns across Europe, midwives began facing increased scrutiny. Some were accused of heresy, others of spreading the plague through their presence at births. The fact that they dealt with blood and fluids didn't help. People feared what they couldn't understand, and they rarely tried to understand women. Here's your historical fact. In some regions, local councils tried to outlaw midwifery altogether during peak plague years. They claimed midwives were unclean and too emotionally involved with their patients, as if compassion were a liability. Some areas even required male supervision at births, which often ended in disaster. You can't exactly deliver a baby while someone reads aloud from a medical scroll, and the scholarly debate is complicated. Some historians say male doctors genuinely believed they were helping, that they simply didn't trust traditional medicine. Others argue it was a power grab. Midwifery represented autonomous female knowledge, and in a time when everyone was scrambling for control, letting women hold the reins, even in childbirth, was seen as dangerous. You slip away from the door as Letta hurls another insult about ivory tower fools. You don't blame her. You've seen what happens when knowledge is silenced. When the people who understand touch, emotion and instinct are dismissed in favour of charts and formulas, especially now, when fear is doing most of the diagnosing. Back in your room, you lay out a few herbs she gave you, mugwort, pennyroyal, and a bit of crushed fennel. To keep your heat gentle, she said, patting your hand. Not every fire needs to burn the house down. You brew it slowly, inhaling the soft, bitter scent. You think about how many women have had to hide what they know just to stay safe, and how many men have made careers out of guessing what those women already understand in their bones. Outside, the evening fades. The bells toll again, one slow note that seems to echo longer each day. You sip the tea, your hands warm around the cup, and for the first time in weeks you feel something like balance, not cured, not immune, but whole. You light a candle before sunrise just to see something warm and moving. The room is silent but alive with scent, wax, wood smoke, and the faint tang of rosemary from the little bundle Letta left in your window frame. Outside, frost still clings to the edges of the cobblestones, a reminder that even the seasons seem confused these days. It's deep summer, but the air carries a chill, like the earth is trying to scrub itself clean. Today your thoughts won't stop returning to what happens after. After the heat, the sighs, the closeness. After the intimacy, whether it's born from love, need, grief, or sheer defiance. Because in the wake of plague-time pleasure, there's something that lingers long after the touch fades. Fluids. Let's not tiptoe around it. In a world ruled by humours and hysteria, bodily fluids from intimacy, sweat, seed, vaginal secretions, even saliva, were viewed with intense suspicion. You'd think a kiss could summon the Antichrist the way people reacted. Even more than the act of sex itself, it was the residue that terrified them, the things left behind, stains, dampness, scent. In medieval medicine, fluids weren't just waste. They were a direct reflection of the soul's state. That meant everything your body released was believed to carry spiritual and medical meaning. And during a plague, well, fluids went from meaningful to potentially murderous. Sweat, for instance, was thought to carry toxins. The same doctors who warned you not to overeat or overlaugh were equally horrified at sweating during intercourse. The body exhales its spirits through heat, one physician wrote, and in passion such vapour escapes unchecked, mingled with foul air and humoral imbalance, which, to be fair, is a poetic way of saying don't get sweaty or you'll die. Semen got its own whole chapter of fear. For men it was considered the essence of the soul, so losing it, especially during illness, was seen as weakening your life force. Some even claimed that ejaculating during plague season could empty the spirit enough to invite death within hours. There's one wild account from a town near Rouen where a man died in bed next to his lover and was buried with the quote, "wasted his breath in pleasure" etched into his marker. Romantic. Meanwhile, women's fluids were labelled unclean in a dozen contradictory ways. Vaginal secretions were said to carry either healing properties or curses, depending on who was talking. Some believed that a woman's pleasure could actually prevent plague, because a satisfied womb meant balanced humours. Others insisted her moisture carried shadowed air, capable of infecting those who touched her. You can imagine how helpful that kind of logic was for anyone trying to feel safe or wanted. But here's where it gets even stranger. In a few rare texts and healer notes, bodily fluids weren't just feared, they were used. There are scattered references to what might best be called experimental medicine. One Italian folk remedy suggests that a cloth soaked with intimate sweat from a healthy lover could be worn around the neck to protect against the plague. Another recommends mixing semen, yes, really, with goat's milk and rosewater as a salve for boils. It was thought to restore the life force through warmth and generative essence. If you just gagged, same. Even more disturbingly, a few accounts tell of deathbed anointments, where the bodily fluids of a person who had survived the plague were used in rituals, spread lightly across the chest or forehead of someone newly infected. You can only imagine how consensual those rituals were. Fringe fact: there was a brief, bizarre moment in the southern Germany where a group of mystic healers claimed to have discovered a sacred fluid ritual. They believed that mixing menstrual blood, semen, and crushed white lilies into a paste and burying it under moonlight would draw out the disease from the soil itself. Unsurprisingly, they were run out of town. But not before 3 copies of the recipe were found hidden in prayer books. And yet, for all the horror and confusion, fluids were also part of how people understood connection. The idea that something passed between lovers, something unseen but deeply real, persisted through both spiritual and medical frameworks. You didn't just share a bed, you shared heat, moisture, breath, essence, maybe even fate. There's a scholarly debate around whether medieval people really believed in the danger of these fluids, or whether it was a convenient excuse to control bodies and reinforce gender boundaries. Some argue that the fear of fluids was rooted in a deeper fear, that intimacy itself made people vulnerable, not just to disease but to each other. Others say it was all part of humoral theory and its endless obsession with balance. Too much of anything was bad, especially if it dripped. Back in your room, you notice the linens on your bed, rumpled, stain-stained, maybe from sweat, maybe from last week's fever. You hesitate, then strip the bed slowly. You boil a kettle. Letter told you to add lavender, but you use vinegar too, just in case. The smell is sharp and mean but comforting, like scouring your skin after a bad dream. When you hang the sheets to dry, you catch yourself staring at your own hands, at your fingertips, at the little scar on your wrist, and you think about the fact that your body remembers every touch, every breath shared, every moment when fluids didn't just frighten you, they connected you to someone else. You used to find that terrifying. Now, you're not so sure. Outside, the sun finally rises. Not warm, but golden, and enough. You hang your hands over the sill and let the air pass through your fingers, wondering if maybe, in spite of everything, something sacred still lingers in the sweat between 2 people who dare to feel. Even when everything tells them not to, you wake with a sense of dread you can't explain. No coughing, no boils, no fever. Just a thrum in your chest like something's coming. Something quiet and irreversible. The candle on your bedside table has melted into a misshapen lump, the wick drowned in wax. You stare at it too long, watching nothing happen. It feels symbolic. And maybe it is. Because today the whispers are about something that's been on your mind, gnawing at the edges of every decision you haven't yet made. The question that keeps lovers lying awake in separate beds, or clinging to each other just a little too tightly. Should you finish, or should you stop? You know what we're talking about. Intercourse interruptus. Not just whether to do the deed, but whether doing all of it, all the way, is worth the risk. Some say it's not. Some say the moment you climax, you open your body in a way that invites the plague to slip in like a thief in the dark. And others say it's the safest thing you can do. Release the pressure, let the humours out, and restore the natural balance. Either way, people are panicking over what to do with their pleasure. The medical texts aren't much help. One warns that to complete the act of Venus in these pestilent days is to loose the gates of disease within the self. Another insists that incomplete passion results in boilings of the blood and melancholy of the mind. So, you're doomed if you do, and doomed if you don't. Classic. You hear stories everywhere. A merchant's wife swears her husband contracted the plague after finishing twice in a single night. A nun in hiding claims she only survived because her lover refused to reach joy. There's even a travelling tinker who swears by a ritual of stopping right at the brink, hopping on one foot and whispering the name of the Archangel Raphael. It's unclear if he's joking. His partner didn't find it funny. The fear of climax, yes, actual panic about the body's highest point of pleasure, has become an obsession. Some physicians describe it as a temporary death. For the span of a heartbeat, one writes, the body forgets itself, the humours scatter, the breath halts. In such a moment, death may slip in and kiss the throat. That line sticks with you, not because it's poetic, because you felt it. That moment after release when everything goes silent inside, when the world fades and your heart flutters just slightly too long. You remember that exact moment with someone once. Skin slick, eyes shut, breath tangled in breath. And now you wonder, could it really be that dangerous? Here's your historical fact. There were real debates in medieval medical circles about whether ejaculation weakened the immune system. Most physicians agreed it reduced vital spirits, but others insisted it prevented build-up of bad humours. Some even recommended moderate release as a way to stay mentally sharp. The key word was always moderate, which is a subjective nightmare. Fringe fact: a rogue monk-turned-physician named Brother Sinantus once claimed he had discovered a method to safely delay male pleasure until the pestilence had passed. His technique involved holding one's breath, pressing a walnut under the tongue, and reciting a psalm backwards during the act. His book was later banned, not because it didn't work, because it included hand-drawn illustrations that were, let's just say, enthusiastically detailed. And then there's the emotional fallout. You hear people talking about guilt now, not just about having sex, but about not being able to finish. Lovers who stop mid-motion and stare at each other asking, are we killing each other? Husbands and wives who touch but never kiss. That feeling of being half connected, half alive, as if joy's shadow hovers just out of reach. You start noticing it in yourself, how your body hesitates even when your mind doesn't, how you catch your breath and wonder if it's worth it. You think about what it means to be interrupted, not just physically, but emotionally. To want something so badly your bones ache with it, but to fear the end of it more than the absence. Is that what intimacy has become? A risk assessment? There's a scholarly debate about this too. Did medieval people actually stop short out of fear of death? Or is that something we've projected backward, trying to make sense of a chaotic time? Some say the abstinence stories were exaggerated, built up by clergy to reinforce guilt. Others believe they reflect a real tension between instinct and survival, between pleasure and punishment, between climax and consequence. But then there are those who didn't stop, who couldn't, or wouldn't. You hear a story, half whispered, half sung, about a couple in a plague-ridden city who met every week in a hidden crypt beneath a burned-out church. They made love in the dark, beneath frescoes of saints and sinners, and when they died, they were found curled around each other, bodies bare, hands clasped, smiles still on their faces. Some call it stupid, others call it brave. You're not sure which it is, maybe both. Back in your room, you light another candle. The flame flickers weakly, trying its best. You lie on your bed alone, and you think about all the people across the city lying just like this, wrapped in fear, in longing, in half-remembered warmth. Some alone, some not. All of them wondering whether finishing what they started might finish them too. You place a hand on your chest. Your heart is steady. For now. You close your eyes and dream of touch uninterrupted. You're halfway through your breakfast, stale bread and goat cheese that tastes faintly like smoke, when someone bangs on your door. Hard. The kind of knock that doesn't ask but demands. You open it slowly, expecting another death notice or one of those travelling preachers who won't leave without a donation or your soul. But instead, you're greeted by the wide-eyed apprentice from the plague house, panting like he has run the length of the continent. He thrusts a folded bit of parchment into your hand, mouth trembling like he's just confessed to murder. You unroll the note. 3 words. I need help. No name, no signature, but the wax seal on the back, broken now, shows a single flower, pressed flat. A violet. You know what that means, or at least you've heard the rumours. This is about the virgin protection myth. It's been bubbling up for weeks, slipping from gossip to doctrine faster than anyone expected. The idea that sleeping with a virgin, yes, literally, could cure or prevent the plague. That untouched flesh holds a kind of purifying magic, a freshness unspoiled by lust, grief, or sit. And now people are acting on it. It's not new, of course. Virginity has always had an uncomfortable pedestal in medieval Europe. Spiritual, moral, political. The untouched body was believed to be closer to the divine, uncorrupted, untainted by passion. But during a plague, that idea mutates into something darker, desperate, predatory. The stories started quietly. A nobleman cured after bedding a young servant girl, a widow who claims her fever broke after lying beside an orphaned boy who had never known sin. No proof, no witnesses, just convenient timing and desperate hope. But as with most plague tales, truth bends easily to wishful thinking. Some towns begin circulating unofficial recommendations, not from doctors, but from folk healers and self-proclaimed mystics. Seek out the pure, they whisper. Their warmth protects, their innocence cleanses. You hear it spoken over ale, in church pews, through cracks in the bakery wall, and you feel the collective shudder ripple through every girl under 15. Soon virginity becomes currency. Young women and boys start disappearing. Not many at first, just one here, one there. Always with an explanation, sent to a monastery, sent to the country, sent somewhere safe. But you know what's really happening? Everyone does, no one wants to say it aloud. You see a girl in the market clutching a rosemary bundle like it's a weapon. She flinches when a man steps too close. Her mother pulls her behind a cart, eyes hard. It's happening everywhere. And it's unofficially endorsed by the silence. Historical fact. This myth, as uncomfortable as it is, genuinely existed during plague years. Not just in Europe, but in parts of Asia too. In some places, it became so widespread that protective orders were issued for orphanages. There are records from Florence and London of young girls being hidden or moved in groups under armed watch, supposedly for moral protection. But what they were really doing was trying to prevent desperation from becoming violence. Fringe fact, a 14th century tract, attributed to a Castilian mystic, claims that a virgin's breath upon the face of the dying could delay death. The practice, if you can believe this, was to have virgins stand beside plague victims and whisper prayers directly into their mouths. Unsurprisingly, the mortality rate didn't improve, but the myth endured. There's even darker stuff. Stories of nobles keeping plague virgins in their homes, isolated and fed herbs daily to preserve their purity. One woman, kept under lock and key, was known only by a nickname, La Limpia, the clean one. She was visited only under moonlight, always masked. When she vanished, no one asked questions. The scholarly debate? It's divided. Some historians insist this was fringe behaviour, exaggerated by later storytellers. Others argue it was far more common than the records suggest, just carefully covered up. After all, how do you document something no one wants to admit happened? Back in your room, you unfold the note again, turning it over in your hands. I need help. You don't know if the writer is the virgin in question or someone trying to get to one. You don't know which is worse, but the flower seal, that violet, used to be a symbol of innocence, of modesty, of first love. Now, it's a flag, a target, a promise. You start noticing them around town, drawn in chalk near doorways, painted on cloth, stitched even into collars and sleeves. Not just violets either. Daisies, lilies, white roses, markers of supposed purity, families flaunting their valuable daughters, others hiding them. It becomes a twisted currency, a negotiation tool. He has 3 healthy sons and a clean daughter, you hear someone say, as if they're describing a prize goat. One man, desperate to save his sick wife, tries to trade his niece to a healer. When she refuses, he beats the door down. But here's what the doctors say, quietly, when no one else is listening. It's nonsense. There is no evidence that virginity protects anyone. No mystical shield. No divine immunity. But they don't say it loudly. Why? Because it's easier to let people believe in something than to face the truth. That the plague doesn't care who you are. It doesn't check your virtue at the door. You look again at the note. You don't respond, you burn it. Then you take a piece of chalk and draw a flower on your own door. Not to invite, but to warn. A black petal. No stem. You sit by the window after dark, watching shadows move through the alley. You think of all the people chasing salvation in bodies that were never meant to save them. And you promise yourself this. If someone comes for your innocence, they'll find something far sharper waiting. The next day, someone paints over your black petal flower with red. Sloppy rushed strokes, a crude circle around it. You stand at your door in silence, staring at the mark. It drips slowly in the afternoon heat, like blood from a wound you didn't know you had. You don't know who did it. Maybe a neighbour, maybe a stranger, maybe someone desperate enough to confuse defiance with danger. By dusk, the whispers start again. Not about you, not yet, but about someone else. A prostitute named Elia who's still operating near the riverbank, long after her brothel was shuttered and the plague patrols warned her to stop. You hear her name said with both reverence and venom. That woman's still taking clients, one man mutters. Does she have a death wish? Another chimes in, or maybe she knows something we don't. You've seen Elia before, once at the well, once outside the chapel steps, always wrapped in a heavy velvet shawl that no summer heat can convince her to shed. Her face is lined, her eyes sharp. Not young, not fragile. You heard once she survived the last fever wave, that she kept working through it, touching people no one else would, giving warmth in a world gone cold. Now, people can't decide what she is. Is she a saint or a sinner? That's the real question, and one no one seems to be able to answer. Because in this new plague reality, sex workers are caught in a strange, cruel paradox. They're still needed, still wanted, still sought in secret by men who preach purity in public. But at the same time, they're feared, condemned, blamed. You hear one old widow call Elia a plague vector wrapped in perfume, and in the same breath, bless her though, my son died smiling after she visited him. That's the thing. Despite the risk, people are still visiting her, slipping down alleys after nightfall, leaving herbs at her door, a loaf of bread, a coin hidden inside a velvet glove. One man even carved a wooden heart with her initials and nailed it to the side of the abandoned tavern. She hasn't taken it down. Historical fact. During plague years, sex workers were both ostracised and indispensable. In many cities, brothels were forced to close under moral pressure. But simultaneously, city leaders quietly permitted certain women to keep working, not for pleasure, officially, but for the mental stabilisation of the population. There are records in Bruges and Venice of authorities turning a blind eye when elite clients visited plague zones for relief. These visits were never written down as sexual, just therapeutic, code words. Everyone knew what they meant. Elia, in this way, has become something larger than herself. People whisper that she's immune, that she absorbs the sickness and burns it away, that her touch balances the humours better than any physician's tincture. Others insist the opposite, that she's carrying death on her tongue and in her sheets, that every man who visits her signs his own death sentence. Fringe fact, in one bizarre incident recorded in central France, a sex worker was arrested for knowingly healing a man of plague through unsanctioned intimacy. The authorities weren't upset that he recovered. They were angry he hadn't paid taxes on his survival. She was fined and forced to wear a white mask in public to signify her dangerous blessing. The man moved to the countryside. She disappeared. Her legend didn't. And here's the twist. Elia doesn't deny any of it. When people ask if she's a healer, she says nothing. When they ask if she's spreading death, she smirks and says, only to those who come with it already inside. The ambiguity keeps her safe. Or maybe just keeps people afraid to get too close unless they really truly want to. There's a scholarly debate on whether figures like Elia were just folklore built on fragments, whether real women became myths the moment they survived too long. Some say these stories reflect a community's need to explain exceptions. Others argue that sex workers occupied a liminal space, both deeply connected to the physical and strangely adjacent to the spiritual. They offered comfort no one else dared to, not out of sainthood, but out of necessity. You find yourself thinking about her that night, not in a lustful way, though sure a little of that too, but more in awe. She's walking a tightrope, giving people something they've been told to fear, providing connection when everyone else is teaching abstinence, touch when the world preaches distance, intimacy when the doctors offer only vinegar and steel masks. You pass her door once, late, just once. A single candle burns in the window, its glow softened by a red cloth. You hear low laughter, hers maybe, and then silence. You don't knock, but you understand now why others do, because when death knocks every day, sometimes the most radical thing a person can do is choose to feel good, even briefly, even irresponsibly. Back in your room, you sit by the hearth and wonder if holiness and desire are really opposites, or just different paths to the same thing, comfort, and if women like Elia aren't walking between them more honestly than anyone else. You fall asleep wondering what kind of strength it takes to be both feared and needed, and to not let either one break you. You find it on your morning walk, a small iron contraption half buried in the dirt behind the chapel, rusted and warped by time, its clasp frozen shut. At first you think it's some broken farming tool, maybe the hinge from a chest. Then you look closer, the curve of metal, the crude keyhole, the jagged edges, and suddenly you know. You're staring at a chastity belt. It takes a moment for your stomach to settle. You've heard the rumours, of course, of noble women locked up like treasure chests while their husbands marched off to war, of devices forged not just to prevent pleasure, but to enforce survival. And now, with the plague running rampant, chastity belts have returned not just as symbols of virtue but as weapons against desire. You carry the rusted thing back to your room in a wrapped cloth, unsure why. Maybe to study it, maybe to understand the lengths people will go to in order to feel safe from their own bodies. Because lately chastity belts are back in fashion, not as antique curiosities, but as real functioning accessories. In the streets and marketplaces, smiths and metalworkers have begun offering their services. Protect your daughter's soul, the signs read. Lock away the heat, defy temptation, outlast the plague. They craft them from iron and bronze, sometimes lined with leather, sometimes not. Some are simple, a flat plate, a small latch, a key worn around a father's neck. Others are elaborate, etched with prayers or tiny icons of saints, as if divine approval could soften the bruises. Parents bring their daughters in under the guise of love. It's just until the plague passes, they say, to keep you safe. From who? From themselves? From others? From the air? The answer changes depending on who's talking, but the underlying message is clear. Your desire is a danger, and your body must be controlled. Historical fact. While chastity belts are often dismissed as legend or fantasy, there is some evidence of their existence in the late medieval period, mostly among the upper classes, and mostly tied to anxiety about female agency. During plague years, those fears escalated. Purity became synonymous with survival, and if a woman's sexuality could invite disease, as some physicians claimed, then locking it away became a civic duty. Fringe fact, one eccentric physician in Bavaria designed a dual protection belt for both men and women, complete with interchangeable attachments and built-in incense pouches to purify the lower regions. He died before anyone could patent it, but the sketches survived. Disturbingly detailed sketches. The belts aren't just physical restraints, they're emotional ones. You see it in the way girls walk now, heads down, steps shorter. In the way married couples avoid touching under watchful eyes. In the way people speak of lust as if it's a contagion worse than the Black Death itself. And here's the truly twisted part. For some, wearing the belt becomes a status symbol, a way to prove virtue in public. My daughter is locked, one merchant boasts. No disease can reach her. As if rusted iron is stronger than grief or rules are stronger than biology. But you also hear the whispers, the horror stories. The woman who couldn't remove hers in time to relieve herself and developed sores that festered. The young wife who was locked up by her husband and left alone while he vanished, only for her body to be found weeks later, still encased in iron, bloated and silent. There's a scholarly debate, naturally. Some argue that chastity belts were rare and more symbolic than functional, often meant to shame rather than restrain. Others suggest they were more common than we like to admit, especially during moments of panic, when entire societies leaned hard into physical control as a substitute for actual protection. Letta the midwife hates them. Metal doesn't stop death, she mutters one afternoon, rolling her eyes as you show her the rusted thing. It just slows down living. You ask her how many girls she's helped unfasten belts over the years. She doesn't answer, just sighs and says, "More than I care to remember, most of them crying, not from pain, from shame." You sit with that for a while. Later you pass a girl no older than 12. Her dress is sewn too tight around her hips, as if her parents couldn't afford the real thing, and try to mimic the restraint with thread. Her face is blank, not sad, just hollow, a body already being taught to fear itself. Back in your room you study the old belt again, the way the lock has fused shut, the tiny pinpricks of rust, like freckles. You try to picture the hands that wore it, the moments of desperation, of rage, of exhaustion. Did she try to pick the lock? Did she forget what it felt like to move freely? And most disturbingly, did she ever start to believe it was necessary? You wrap it in cloth again and place it under your bed. Not out of fear, out of mourning. Because in a world that claims to be protecting you, it's easy to forget that control often wears the same face as care. That love, when twisted by fear, turns into a cage. And that the hardest locks to break are the ones placed on you for your own good. Outside, someone hammers metal. Not a blacksmith, just a father, reshaping fear into hinges. You turn away from the sound, but it follows you, echoing long into the night. It starts as a whisper in the marketplace, barely louder than the rustle of dried leaves blowing along the cobblestones. Someone's painting again. Not walls, not signs, but bodies. You hear it in pieces, rumours about figures dancing in candlelight, paint dripping down skin, laughter that sounds too alive for a city in mourning. They call it foolishness, or sin, or something worse, but you know better. You've seen that kind of light before, the flicker of rebellion dressed as beauty. The rumours lead to a crumbling bathhouse at the edge of town. The place was abandoned last winter, when the last steam pipes cracked from frost. Now it's quiet, too quiet. But inside, behind the warped wooden doors and the curtain of rosemary vines, someone's draped like a makeshift veil. There's something extraordinary happening. Erotic art, in the middle of plague season. The room glows from oil lamps set low in niches, their flames dancing along the uneven stone walls. The smell is overwhelming. Wax, old water, dried roses, something peppery you can't name. On a makeshift canvas, a white bedsheet pinned between two broken window frames, is a painting. Two lovers, nude, caught in a moment of tangled limbs and soft mouths. It's raw, imperfect, and alive. You stare at it for too long, your breath hitching. A woman walks past you, nude from the waist up, her chest streaked with crimson pigment. She doesn't flinch when you meet her eyes. "He paints to remember," she says. "We pose so we're not forgotten." His name is Thomas, the artist. You know of him. He once painted saints in the chapel, faces pale and holy, halos glowing like sunrise. Now he paints skin flushed with desire, mouths open in pleasure, hands gripping hips like they're afraid to let go. He doesn't ask permission from the council, or the church, or anyone really. He paints because, as he puts it, there are things more contagious than death. He tells you something else too. Since the plague began, no one has posed for him out of vanity. They come because they're afraid they'll vanish without being seen. They strip off their clothes and their grief, and they offer their bodies not for lust, but for proof. I was here. I was beautiful. I felt something once. Historical fact. Despite widespread death and religious repression, erotic art flourished in private during plague years. Marginalia in manuscripts, hidden frescoes behind panels, tiny carvings tucked into pews, art as resistance, art as memory. And yes, sometimes art as arousal. But often it was all three at once, life, death, and desire tangled together like brush strokes. Fringe fact. There's a preserved journal in a Swiss archive that describes a painter who only painted lovers after they died. Cleaned and posed, cheeks rouged, limbs arranged with eerie tenderness. He believed capturing their beauty, post-mortal, gave them peace. The journal ends with his confession that he finally painted himself. No one knows what happened after. You walk slowly through the bathhouse, heart pounding. The walls are covered now, not just with paintings, but poems, charcoal sketches, letters, pressed flowers, a shrine to the flesh. You hear murmured reading from a corner, "Touch me like the world has not ended." Someone claps softly, not applause, agreement. There's a scholarly debate about these erotic expressions during plague years. Some believe they were hidden acts of rebellion, a way to defy death through sensual remembrance. Others argue they were survival mechanisms, intimacy frozen in ink and colour to combat the numbness. The academic language makes it all sound very clean, very clinical. But this is messy. This is sweat and pigment and the sound of a brush scraping canvas as someone moans softly in the next room. This is human! You catch a glimpse of another painting, unfinished, still dripping. A man and woman entangled on what looks like a funerary shroud. Her mouth open in laughter, his eyes shut like he's dreaming. In the corner, Thomas has written in red, "If we die, Let it be like this. It punches the breath from your lungs. You sit, overwhelmed. A woman beside you offers her hand. You take it. Her skin is cool. Do you want to be painted? She asks. You hesitate, then nod. Later, as you disrobe and step into the soft lamplight, you don't feel shame. Not fear. What you feel is seen. And maybe for the first time in weeks, you feel alive. Back in your room, hours later, the charcoal outline of your pose still smudged on your shoulder, you stare at your own reflection. There's colour in your cheeks. You touch your collarbone, remembering the brush, the hand, the steady voice telling you to breathe. You sleep with the window open, the cool air brushing your skin, and you dream, not of dying, but of red paint, warm hands, and laughter that refuses to fade. You wake to music, not the kind that plays from lutes in noble houses, or the sombre chants that crawl out of churches, but real music, wild, erratic, irresistible. You sit up, blink the morning blur from your eyes, and realise the sound isn't just in your ears, it's in your bones. A beat you can't place, somewhere between laughter and madness. The square is already alive by the time you reach it. Not bustling, not busy, buzzing. People have gathered. Not to sell, not to preach, but to move. Feet stamping, skirts twirling, hands clapping. A woman in a red scarf is dancing so hard her feet barely touch the ground. A man beside her spins, laughing, eyes glassy. At first you think it's joy. Then you see the tremor in his limbs, the way his jaw clenches between breaths. This is not celebration. This is dancing plague. It's not the first you've heard of it. Rumours have trickled in for weeks, entire villages overtaken by sudden, uncontrollable dance. People leaping, shaking, spinning until their legs give out. Some collapse from exhaustion. Others keep going until their hearts burst. No one can explain it. Some call it a curse. Others say it's mass hysteria. You watch the crowd, uncertain. Is this pleasure or a warning? The woman in the red scarf locks eyes with you. Her smile is radiant or manic. You can't decide. She beckons. You don't move. This isn't the usual plague behaviour. No vinegar-soaked rags, no incense, just skin, heat, rhythm, and the eerie sense that this might be a kind of madness born from desire. Because that's the other rumour, that the dancing is not just compulsion, it's ecstasy. That people dance themselves into a frenzy because they've forgotten how to feel anything else. Because it's the only way to burn off the fever inside. Because when they stop moving, the world feels dead again. You see it in their faces. Their eyes roll back, their mouths open. Not screaming, but moaning. This isn't just dance. It's like watching people make love to the sky. A bishop you pass spits and mutters, "Devils, lustful, rhythmic devils." He tells people not to watch. Looking invites the spirit. But everyone looks. Everyone. Historical fact. The most infamous episode of dancing plague struck Strasbourg in 1518, but similar incidents occurred earlier during the height of the Black Death. Contemporary reports describe groups, dozens, sometimes hundreds, gathering and dancing for hours or days. Some believed it was a disease, others called it a spiritual possession. A few labelled it a punishment for sinful indulgence, an ironic end for those who once chased pleasure. Fringe fact: in one village near Aachen, a woman reportedly broke into frenzied dance and cried out the name of a lover she'd lost to plague. The townspeople swore she danced for 3 days straight, eating nothing until she collapsed. When she woke, her fever was gone. Her story spread like fire, and people began seeking out dancing as a cure. For illness, for grief, for desire. You walk slowly around the edge of the crowd, careful not to get too close. You hear the pounding of feet, the sharp gasps of breath, and beneath it all the low hum of music that seems to rise from nowhere. Drums, maybe, but it feels internal, like a heartbeat echoing in stone. Then someone grabs your hand. It's the man with the clenched jaw. His grip is strong, not painful, urgent. "Please," he says, "don't let me stop. If I stop, I'll break." He's crying, smiling, sweating. He pulls away before you can answer, already swept back into the spinning bodies. There's a scholarly debate, of course. Was the dancing plague physiological, a response to contaminated bread, or neurological illness, or psychological, born of fear and repression? Some historians now argue it was a release valve for societies held too tightly by grief, religion, and sexual control, a sudden, irrepressible need to move, to feel, to surrender. Others point out how oddly sensual the episodes were. Reports often mention rhythmic panting, flushed skin, exposed bodies, clothing shed, dancing done not in pairs but in clusters, synchronized, chaotic, magnetic. There were even accusations of orgies hidden in the frenzy, though whether that's truth or moral panic is hard to say. You feel the pull, though, not the desire to dance exactly, but the desire to be swept, to give in to something larger than your own tightly clenched survival. You watch the woman in red again. She's slowed now, swaying, her eyes half-lidded. Another dancer moves behind her, hands ghosting along her hips, not quite touching. They move together, breath matching, not lovers, but not strangers. You realise this isn't about sex, not really. It's about permission, to want, to need, to lose control in a world that demands rigidity. This is what happens when too much is bottled for too long. It explodes, and when it does, it doesn't look like rebellion. It looks like a woman spinning in the sun, laughing as tears stream down her cheeks. You don't join the dance, but that night in your room you move, not for show, not for release, but for remembrance, a slow, solitary rhythm, hips swaying, arms curling over your head, feet bare on the cold floor. You close your eyes and breathe until you forget where you are, until you remember that your body wasn't built only to survive, it was built to feel. And that might be the most defiant dance of all. You've begun to notice how the wealthy speak in riddles now. Not directly, never plainly. Everything's softened, cloaked in metaphor. They wear brooches shaped like doves and say things like, "Love must wait for clearer skies," or "The heart should be courted from across the garden wall." Meanwhile, their sons sneak out after dark, and their daughters write letters pressed with perfume and sealed in wax, letters that are never mailed but somehow still find their way into waiting hands. Courtly love, already complicated in the best of times, has become a theatrical farce in the plague years. You see it unfold around you in fragments. A nobleman reciting a poem to his betrothed from 3 paces away, careful not to breathe too heavily. A lady dropping her kerchief as she passes, not by accident but ritual, her small rebellion against distance. The romance continues, yes, but now it's a ballet of hesitation, a game of hearts held behind gloved hands. You remember what courtly love was meant to be, an idolized dance of longing, all sighs and chaste glances, devotion without consummation. Now, under the weight of death, it's more literal than ever. Lovers pine without touch, seduce with sermons and shadow puppets. You heard of one knight who serenaded his lady for 14 nights straight through her window, never once stepping foot inside. He died on the 15th. They say she hasn't opened the shutters since. This obsession with distance has spawned a whole new genre of romance. Plague courtship. A performance of love that flourishes only in absence. In some noble households, men are encouraged to court by letter alone. "Let your words carry your passion," a noble woman instructs her son. "Do not hand her your death." Meanwhile, women write back in cryptic poetry, see, "My heart warms to thee, but not thy breath." Entire romances blossom and wither without a single embrace. A merchant's daughter even composed a set of safe seduction rules, which include instructions like write only by candlelight, seal all notes with lavender oil, and look but never lean. Historical fact, letter writing as courtship soared during plague years. In some regions, nobles were instructed to maintain romantic distance, even within arranged marriages. Intimacy was postponed, sometimes indefinitely, with some couples living in the same household without sharing a bed, or even a room, for the first year. It wasn't just custom, it was survival. But of course letters can't touch, and poems don't warm the skin, so despite all the rules, the temptation to break protocol pulses beneath every polite stanza. You hear stories. One young man, driven mad by separation, sneaks into his lover's chamber at midnight dressed as her servant. They make love in silence, never speaking a word. He leaves before dawn. She catches the plague 4 days later. Fringe fact. In certain French provinces, noble women began commissioning erotic miniatures of themselves, paintings that showed them in more revealing poses, but with veils or masks added as a symbolic nod to modesty. These were passed privately to lovers, accompanied by letters that blended flirtation and prayer. Some were even folded into hollowed-out books, disguised as psalters. The contradictions of plague-era courtship are everywhere. Love is encouraged, but only in moderation. Desire is praised, but only when expressed in writing, or through dance, or via the strings of a lute plucked from a safe distance. You watch a young man leave wildflowers on a noblewoman's step, their petals coated in vinegar for protection. She watches from her balcony but doesn't come down. Later that night, the wind blows the flowers away. Scholarly debate lingers over how much of this courtly love was performance and how much was real. Some argue it was a romanticised myth, ritual for ritual's sake, practised only by those with the luxury of time. Others suggest that in the absence of safe touch, people leaned into drama because it was the only form of intimacy left. A love letter may not save you, but it gives shape to longing. It keeps the soul from shrinking. You sit down that evening with a scrap of parchment and try your hand at it. Not a letter to anyone in particular, just a few lines scribbled in the candlelight. Though death walks close, I dream of hands, not to pull me from the fire, but to hold mine while I burn. You crumple it, then smooth it again, fold it once, set it on the sill, knowing no one will read it. Or maybe someone will. That's the thing about longing, it needs no reply to feel real. Outside, a group of nobles passes on horseback. Their cloaks are embroidered, their gloves spotless. One leans down to toss a white rose at a waiting maid. She doesn't catch it. She just watches it land, then slowly picks it up with tongs and sets it aside like a biohazard. You can't help but laugh. Not because it's funny, because it's all so tragic and grand and absurd. Back in your room, you light a second candle, not for light, but for company. You imagine someone sitting across from you writing back, not to fix the world, just to say, I'm still here too. And maybe, for now, that's enough. The sun barely rises these days. It just kind of leaks into the sky, grey and slow, and not particularly committed. You sit by the window chewing a crust of bread so dry, it might technically be a building material, watching dust dance in the weak light. You're not expecting company. So when a gentle knock sounds at your door, you assume it's a mistake. But it's not. Standing in the hall is a woman in simple robes, maybe 30, maybe 60, one of those ageless faces made sharper by years of holding secrets. Around her neck hangs a small charm, 2 entwined snakes carved from bone. You've seen that symbol before, not in churches, not in town halls, in certain corners of the forest where healers live and legends don't knock. She doesn't introduce herself, just says, I heard you've been asking about the body. You let her in. Her name, eventually, is Marjolaine. She's what they once called a hedge witch, though she prefers the term listener. People come to her not for miracles, but for truth. She brings herbs wrapped in silk, honey fermented with elderberry, and something else, a book, handwritten, bound in what looks like rabbit skin. Inside are pages of sketches and notes that make your head spin. Diagrams of the human body drawn in bold, unapologetic curves. Sexual, anatomical, and somehow sacred all at once. This, she says, placing it in your lap, is not about sin. This is survival. You flip through. There are instructions for birthing, for pleasuring, for easing cramps, for quieting grief. There are recipes for teas that soothe after lovemaking, and poultices to cool the heat of unwanted arousal. One page is devoted entirely to the shape and movement of breath during orgasm. Another offers a prayer for healing after touch that was not wanted. You look up. She's watching you. I don't deal in shame, she says simply. And then you understand you've stepped into the realm of something almost extinct. Sacred sexuality. Not lust hidden behind candlelight. Not trembling courtly glances. Not hysteria-induced moaning, mistaken for penance. No. This is sex understood as medicine, as a force of renewal. A system of cycles, rituals and rhythms used not to control people but to heal them. You learn that in some parts of the countryside, far from the city's judgmental eyes, people still gather in quiet circles to practice intimacy as ritual. Not orgies, not indulgence, something older and gentler. Partners, sometimes strangers, sometimes long-time lovers, join in focused, consensual acts of closeness. Skin on skin, breath synced, hearts aligned. Sometimes it leads to climax, sometimes it ends in sleep, sometimes in crying. There is no goal except connection. Historical fact. While much of medieval Europe was consumed by sin-based theology, there remained undercurrents of older traditions, pre-Christian, earth-centered views that saw sexuality as life-giving, not shameful. Texts like the Secretum Secretorum and the Trotula discuss sensuality and health in the same breath. Some midwives and herbalists quietly passed down this knowledge, hiding pages between hymnals or sewing symbols into their aprons. Fringe fact, In the remote hills of southern Italy, a sect of women known as the Donne della Terra, women of the earth, held clandestine rites during plague years. They believed the plague was not just a disease, but a rupture in the balance between body and spirit. Their solution? Sacred unions performed under full moons, combining breath, music and touch. Survivors of these rites often reported feeling repaired. There's a scholarly debate about all this, naturally. Some claim these were exaggerated folk tales, posthumously embroidered by the romantic historians. Others insist the practices were very real, and that the church spent centuries trying to suppress them, labelling such acts as carnal heresy. The truth, as always, is tangled somewhere in the roots. You spend hours with Marjolaine that day. She teaches you a grounding breath, 4 counts in, 4 counts out, with your hands pressed to your abdomen. It keeps you in your body, she says, and reminds it that it's not a threat. She hands you a small linen pouch. Inside, grains of paradise, powdered damiana, and dried linden flowers. A sensual blend, not to excite necessarily, but to soften, to reintroduce safety to a body that's only known bracing. Steep it in warm milk, she tells you, then lie down somewhere soft and remind your skin it belongs to you. That night you do just that. The milk is sweet and earthy. The air is still. You undress slowly, not to entice, not to seduce, just to exist. Skin bare beneath a blanket, you breathe as she taught. One hand on your chest, the other at your ribs. No one touches you. But something unwinds. You remember every time someone told you pleasure was dangerous. You remember every door locked, every glance loaded with fear, every rule about what not to do. And then you think of this. Your body, still alive, still capable of feeling. You fall asleep not afraid of what might touch you, but hopeful about what you might choose to touch next. The final toll of the bells comes at twilight, not just for a death, though yes, someone has passed, but as a ceremonial closing of something else, a chapter, a fever, maybe even the plague itself. The bells ring slow and solemn, and you feel the vibration in your chest, as if the air is finally exhaling. The streets are still, windows cracked open for the first time in weeks, or maybe months. Birds chirp without being drowned out by coughing. There's a hush over everything, not sealed bumps, but readiness. And then, you hear it. Laughter. Not the brittle, cracked laughter you've grown used to. The kind people let slip when they're delirious or grieving. This is soft, warm, like water over stones. You step into the street and follow the sound, drawn like a moth. Around the corner, just beyond the apothecary's shop, people have gathered. No one's shouting, no one's praying. They're just there, talking, smiling, existing, and in the centre of it all is Elia. Yes, that Elia, the sex worker turned half-legend, survivor, healer, outcast, muse. She's wearing a robe the colour of ripe plums, her silver hair braided with twine. She's not dancing, she's not seducing, she's sitting, and people are sitting with her. She's started something that wasn't planned, a gathering, a ritual, a reclamation. They call it the closing of the skin. No one's quite sure where the name came from. Some say it refers to the way wounds knit shut. Others think it's a metaphor for desire settling back into the body, no longer spilling out uncontrolled. Either way, it's beautiful. Each person comes forward and speaks one thing they want to release, one thing they want to remember, and one thing they wish they had done differently, with their lovers, with themselves, with their fear. Elia listens, nods, and ties a strip of linen around their wrist. You've closed the wound, she says. Now fill the space. You wait in the back, unsure if you'll speak, but something moves in you, and suddenly your feet carry you forward. When it's your turn, you whisper, I release shame. I remember breath. I wish I had let myself stay. She smiles and ties the linen. It smells faintly of lavender and smoke. Historical fact. While formal plague rituals often focused on death, there were documented survivor ceremonies too, quiet gatherings where communities acknowledged the pain they had lived through. They weren't always public. Sometimes they happened in homes, barns, abandoned churches, but they existed. The church rarely acknowledged them, but people did. Fringe fact? A handful of personal journals from the 14th century describe something called the final warmth. A practice where lovers, reunited after surviving, would lie skin to skin in silence for exactly 1 hour, breathing in tandem to seal their spirits against further loss. It wasn't sexual, it was crid. There's scholarly debate, naturally. Some argue these practices were therapeutic, a form of communal trauma recovery. Others say they're mythologized, a retroactive wish for closure in a time that rarely offered any. But you know better now. You've seen what happens when people name their wounds. You've seen how naming turns into healing, how healing makes space for desire again. Later that night, you sit alone with a candle, the linen still tied around your wrist. You touch the edge of your collarbone and think of every person you met on this strange, harrowing, tender journey. The lovers who touched in defiance, the ones who abstained out of fear, the midwives and painters and mystics, the bodies that moved toward death not with panic but with arms open wide, choosing to feel, even when feeling was dangerous. You lie back on your bed, limbs loose, heart quiet. The moon peers in through the window, pale and watchful, and you realise you were never just surviving, you were witnessing, participating, becoming. You fall asleep with the sound of laughter still echoing in your ears, the smell of sweat and honey and rosemary lingering in your sheets, and your dreams are full not of fear, not of fire, not of disease, but of hands, reaching not to take or to grasp or to shield, but simply to hold. So here you are. The linen is still tied around your wrist, faded now, the scent of lavender long since gone. Outside your window the world has softened. No bells today, no shrubdream, or processions or chants rising into the dawn. Just birdsong, just the faint rustle of leaves. Just quiet. You sit with it. It's strange, isn't it? How much we think we know about history, dates, kings, wars, maps, and yet none of that tells you what it felt like to breathe someone else's breath during a time when every exhale could be a death sentence. None of it tells you what it's like to long for a kiss you're too afraid to give, or to strip off your clothes not out of lust, but because for just 1 second you want to feel like your body still belongs to you. You've seen, alumnus, how the plague warped everything it touched. Medicine, marriage, faith, even pleasure. You've wandered through bedrooms and brothels, back alleys and bathhouses, monasteries and moonlit groves. You've met monks who equated desire with damnation and midwives who saw touch as a form of prayer. You've watched people try to chain up their lust in iron belts, or purge it through dance, or drown it in letters that would never be answered. And somehow, despite it all, love survived. Not just love in the grand romantic sense, but love of skin, love of story, love of still being alive. And now, the world hasn't exactly healed, but it aches differently. The ache of regrowth, not rot. You lie back, breathing slowly, your limbs heavy in the best way. And if you close your eyes, just for a minute, you can almost feel the press of a hand in yours. Not grabbing, not needing, just present, just there. You made it. Through the fear, through the rules, through the hunger and hush and heat. And even if the world breaks again, and it might, you'll remember this. There is power in desire. There is softness in survival. And there is always a way back to yourself. Sleep now, you're safe, you're home,